This happened back when I was 17, my last Halloween at home before going away to college. It was Halloween in our peaceful town where nothing bad ever happens. Our house is in the wealthier side of town, and while our house would be described as gorgeous by anyone not from the area, the real head turner is our next door neighbor's house. It sits on that line of being called just a huge house or a mansion. They always go crazy with their decorations for any holiday, specifically Halloween and Christmas. This one year was no exception. By October 1st, they already had all their crazy decorations out. Some houses go the cute and innocently spooky route, like with smiling ghosts and blow-up decorations. But our neighbors go the actual scary route, with the fake graves, fake bloody body bags, actually scary-looking fake corpses, etc. It actually draws a lot of attention. People know to drive by and take videos, so it's never uncommon to see cars just sitting in front of their house in the middle of the street from time to time. I'll rename my neighbors' names to Mike and Donna just to not blow up their spots even more. Fast forward to Halloween Day. It was luckily a Friday this year, so that meant parties and all that could be held on actual Halloween. My dog Bear sleeps downstairs in the corner of our dining room, and he woke me up really early morning, like 4 a.m. when it was still pitch black outside. He was barking at something outside. I yelled across the house to shut up, Bear, and my mom came out into the hall and did the same. Bear stopped barking after this, but I had no idea what he was barking at. I fell back asleep quickly after that, then woke up to my alarm like 2 hours later. So I started getting ready for school as my dad was leaving for work, and as he stepped out onto the front deck, he came back in and got mad at me and said, "Damn it, Zach, clean up the dog shit." He thought I let our dog crap in the front of the house for some reason. I told him I definitely didn't though. He was in a hurry, so he left without more arguing. Next up, it was my turn to leave for school, and as I left the house, I got a whiff of something kind of unpleasant. I now knew what my dad was talking about. I didn't see any dog crap anywhere though. Later when I got home around 2, I still smelled that smell. I had no idea what it was, but it was really starting to stink. My parents were both at work, and my parents wanted me to hand out candy when trick-or-treaters started coming. It wasn't until around 4 to 5 that they started coming. When I opened the door to the first few trick-or-treaters, I'd get a whiff of that increasingly horrible stink, and the kids and their parents clearly smelt it too because they were all commenting on it. One parent told me it was even worse next door. I started to know whenever to expect the doorbell to ring because I'd hear groups of people pointing out how horrible it smelt. At one point, I saw Mike and Donna in front of their house, looking around. So I went outside and went over to ask them if they smelt that too, but that was hardly a question because it got worse on their property. It clearly was coming from the front of their property, but there wasn't any dog crap or anything. The smell was coming from one of the body bag decorations, only it apparently wasn't a decoration. The couple had a number of fake body bags leaned on things like the mailbox and their front tree, but there was one just laying flat on the ground, and Mike said to Donna that he didn't put that one there when she asked. The smell was unbearable from this bag. Mike ran to grab a knife and cut the bag open, and what we saw made me sick. He of course cut the top of the bag open, revealing the rotting face of an actual human corpse inside the bag. We all put our hands over our mouths in disgust, wanting to throw up. And of course, there was no audience of kids and parents to see what was going on. It became a huge scene. Mike called the cops, and their whole front yard literally became a crime scene with people gathering from all over to watch, even though the cops kept telling everyone to clear out. The body was taken away. I told the police that my dog Bear was barking last night at like 4 a.m., and he may have been barking at whoever dumped the body there. Mike told my dad a week later that the body turned out to be a local 30-something-year-old guy who had taken his own life. As for who dropped the body there or why, that's unclear. Mike and Donna are very likable people, so we all think it was somebody who just looked at them as some rich, snobby household that overdoes it with the decorations for attention. Obviously, there are some sick people out there. I'm a single 24-year-old female living alone in my grandma's house. The house was basically left to me after she passed away because my mom didn't want to sell it and she also doesn't want to move out of her house. So I get to stay in my grandma's house alone. This was last year Halloween, my first one living in the house alone. I considered just leaving a bowl of candies on the stoop, but I figured that was not the best way to associate a friendly face to the house that I was new to living in. The day went pretty normally. Halloween was on a Sunday, so the trick-or-treaters started coming early on in the day, and it continued all day. Some people asked if my grandma was home, sadly unaware that she had passed away. I explained to those people that I'm her granddaughter, and that I live here now. My grandma was a very loved lady, so it was no shock to me how many people asked about her that day. Mostly everyone who knocked on the door was very friendly and normal. Later on that night, past 9 o'clock, when the trick-or-treaters had dwindled down almost completely, I heard a voice outside the front door say trick or treat. No knocking or ringing the doorbell. I was in the kitchen, so I definitely would have heard any knocking, but it did seem possible that he thought he pressed the doorbell but didn't. When I went out to greet him, I saw it was this average height guy in a purple suit and creepy plastic mask. I don't really know what the costume was supposed to be, but it was interesting, I guess. When I opened the door, he said trick or treat again, but the strange thing was I could tell the guy was a bit older, like a full-grown adult, and he was changing his voice to be a little higher pitched, like he was trying to sound younger. It was strange. I assumed he may have had some issues, so whatever. I asked him what his costume was supposed to be, but he didn't answer. We just made eye contact through his mask. I took 2 pieces of candy and dropped it in his pillow sack he was holding, which looked completely empty. That was the part that weirded me out the most. He looked into the sack, then back at me. I said have a good night and closed the door. That was weird. He was the last trick-or-treater of the night. I wondered if he was accompanied by anybody watching over him, because I assumed he was special needs or something. He was clearly a 30-something-year-old man behind that mask. The rest of the candies I just left on the dining room table. Halloween was over. Or so I thought. The next night, around the same time as the previous night, I heard a loud trick-or-treat at the front door. That same creepy fake high-pitched voice. I had to have imagined it, I thought. But when I went to check through the peephole in the door, it was him again, in the same costume. And by the looks of it, he had an equally empty pillow sack as the night before. I didn't open the door, no shot in hell. A few minutes later, I heard him shout trick or treat again. I ignored it. In fact, I shut off the living room lights to basically say, hey, get off my stoop, I'm not answering the door. I went upstairs to my room and shut the door and started watching TV in there instead. Out of sight, out of mind. Until I heard a pop at my window. Something was thrown at it, like a rock. I muted the volume on the TV, and a few seconds later, I heard the familiar trick or treat. I suddenly was in panic mode. Why was he doing this? I went to the window, lifted it up, and looked down. That man in the purple suit and mask was looking up at me. I threatened him with calling the police. In response, he very slowly lifted his empty-looking pillow sack up and held it open. It seemed he was some asshole trying to scare me, but Halloween was over and I wasn't amused. I called 911 and police showed up in under 10 minutes. The guy was still outside. He refused to talk to them, so they put him in handcuffs and took his mask off, and as I figured, he was some creepy-looking 30-something-year-old guy. They told me they were bringing him down to the station, but apparently they let him out within 48 hours, because 2 nights later, he came back to my house, this time at the backyard door. He never knocked or rang the bell. He'd just stand outside with his empty sack and costume, creepily yelling trick or treat. I called the police again and told them he's back, and once again the police came and arrested him. I swear to God, a week later the man had returned once again, throwing a rock at my window. This time when I called 911, he seemed to actually disappear before the police had gotten there. But regardless, it seemed the police didn't really care to do anything. Either that or they couldn't. Luckily, I think the man lost interest because he hasn't returned since then. At least as far as I know, unless he's been hiding in my bushes watching me, which is disturbing to imagine. Halloween is coming up, and I'm kind of nervous he's gonna come back. I was 10 years old in 5th grade. I was planning on going trick-or-treating with my friend Jordan. We already knew the route we were going to take. It was the first year that we were being allowed to trick-or-treat alone. My mom gave us big bags for candy. It was a weekend night, so we could luckily stay out later. We did some day trick-or-treating, and after about 2 hours, we went back to my house and took a break. My parents ordered Chinese food for dinner. Jordan stayed for dinner. Then around like 7 or 8, we went back out for some night trick-or-treating. My parents wanted us to stay close. We obviously said yes to that, but we kind of strayed off a different, further away route that we knew less kids would go down. Everything was going as normal. Less houses would open their doors after dark, we noticed though. But there were still some kids out trick-or-treating since it was the weekend. One house we got to, we rang the bell, and within like 10 seconds, as if he were waiting by the door, a man opened up. Looking back, he was a bald man, looked like he was 45, and had a small gap between his 2 front teeth that we noticed when he smiled as he opened the door. He was overly friendly from the start, complimenting our costumes, trying to ask us where we're from, and just being overly conversational. We just wanted candy. He eventually said he has the candy inside if we want to come in for a second, followed with he wanted to show us this cool Halloween decoration he had inside. He described it as some talking skeleton trapped in a cage begging to be let out. Jordan and I weren't comfortable going inside this man's house though, obviously. When we said that in not so many words, he said he understood and asked if we wanted to come in real quick just to pick out the candies that we wanted. We said it's fine, he could just give us whatever. He tried to insist one more time and we said no, and he said no worries, then went inside to grab us some random candies. They were these chewy candies wrapped in see-through wrappers. We thanked him and left. As we walked away from his front door, we noticed he didn't close the door. He just watched us as we left. We walked away from his house down the sidewalk, and after another glance back, we now noticed he was walking in front of his house slowly with his hands on his hips. We considered running away, but there were other people down the block, so nothing would happen most likely. We just skipped the next house and went to the house 2 doors down. A woman answered, and we told her about the creepy man 2 doors down. She said she didn't know him at all, but that we should tell our parents when we get home. We ran into these 2 kids going in the direction of the creepy man's house, and we stopped them and warned them not to go there, and their reaction said it all. They already went to his house too, and had the same exact thing happen to them. They looked to be our age as well. We asked what candy he gave them, and it turned out to be the same candies. They already threw theirs away, so we dug into our bags, found them, and threw them away as well. If anybody would be sus enough to lace candies, it would be a guy like that. We wondered what exactly that man was trying to do if we were to have actually entered his house. Like, was he actually just innocently trying to show us something, or did he have other intentions? Our question was answered the next day, because that man ended up on the news for attempting to lure kids into his house, claiming he had a new puppy. It seemed his story changed for different kids, possibly based on their ages. Thank God it sounded like everyone was smart enough to not enter the man's house. When my dad passed away, not only did he pass along his fishing boat, but he also passed along his love of fishing to me. The boat is a Rodman 1250, which has a decent-sized cabin, allowing me to go overnight deep-sea fishing. I usually fish off the coast of Mississippi, and would sail for an hour out to sea, then stop and spend the rest of the day fishing. That's exactly what I did one Friday, taking my cousin Jack. I planned on spending the night and fishing most of Friday, then sailing back. So after sailing out to sea for about an hour, I picked a spot for us to stop and cast our lines. We brought a radio and tons of beers to make the time more pleasant. The sun started to set, and seeing the sun setting in the horizon with no visual intrusions was a beautiful sight. Perhaps the last pleasant thing that would happen that night. By the time the sky was completely dark, we had already packed our stuff for the night and were inside the cabin playing cards and eating burgers. Mid-conversation, Jack stopped me and told me to listen. There was the sound of a boat motor out in the distance. We left the cabin to look into the horizon, but with no moon. It was just too dark to see more than maybe 50 feet in front of us. But over the calm waves, we did hear a boat motor. Whoever was out there didn't have their lights on. The lights in my cabin were on, which was definitely enough for anyone to see us and avoid hitting us. We were expecting the sound of the other boat to sail away into the night. However, it seemed to circle us for a bit, then abruptly stop. The motor just cut, and there was nothing but the sound of the calm water splashing against the boat. Jack started acting a little paranoid. He thought we were being stalked. He wanted me to use the spotlight to look for where this boat could be. I didn't want to do that because that would be a bit obnoxious and obvious. To make him happy though, I started to drive the boat for a few minutes away from the last direction we heard that engine stop. Although maybe I did it because I was a little suspicious about it as well. After a solid 5 minutes of driving the boat in the opposite direction, I killed the motor and we went back inside the cabin to resume playing cards. It felt like only seconds after we sat down, we heard it again. This time I heard it first, but and it sounded like the motor was being given much less gas. We went outside again, and at that instant the sound stopped. This time I agreed with Jack. Turning on the spotlight was a necessity now. The spotlight only rotated 180 degrees, so I turned the boat a little to the right so that I could point the light out in the direction we heard the boat. The beam of light shot far into the horizon. I felt my heart racing as I slowly turned the light to point more to the right, and finally I stopped when the light started to land on a boat floating not too far away from us. I turned the light off at once and told Jack to turn the cabin lights off as well. I put the boat in full throttle and sped away from the area. I steered the boat for about 5 to 10 minutes before thinking it was enough. We hung out outside for a while to ensure we weren't followed again. When it seemed safe to do so, we went to sleep. However, I awoke to a thumping coming from above my head, above the cabin. I looked over at Jack, sleeping on the couch. I whispered his name a few times to wake him up, and I pointed up at the ceiling. He looked up, then back at me, with a look on his face telling me he heard the thumps. I opened the door to the deck and ran outside, and saw 2 men, one on the bow of my boat, the other on a boat floating directly next to mine. Jack came running out behind me. Both of the men slowly put their hands up in front of their faces and claimed they meant no harm. The one on my boat said they were simply almost out of gas and needed help. He said he was going to knock on my cabin door to ask for assistance, but in my head I was thinking, why was he on the bow of my boat then? I very low-key flicked Jack's thigh to indicate to him that I was getting ready to do something rash. The guy stepped down from the front of the boat to the lower deck, right in front of Jack and I. He was significantly taller and bigger than us. He looked at me for a few moments, then reached out his hand, expecting a handshake, without saying anything. I knew something was about to go down with these guys, and for all I knew, that could start with my shaking his hand. Instead of shaking his hand, I pushed the guy overboard into the water with all my strength. Then I ran up the stairs to turn the boat on, while I yelled at Jack to make sure they didn't get back on the boat. We were able to lose them in the night for good this time. I didn't stop though. I kept going the full 2 hours straight back to the shore. We made it back to my dock, and we slept on my boat that night. The next morning we packed up and drove home. Strange things can happen out at sea in the dark, but I never anticipated anything like that. I don't know what those guys were planning on doing to us on my boat, but considering they had been making a point of stalking us, I know it was nothing good. A few years ago, I went on a Norwegian cruise with a few friends. It started out as a great little vacation. However, by the 3rd day at sea, things started getting weird. After 2 days of eating constant sushi, I started to feel a little dizzy and lightheaded at times. My friends told me no more sushi, as it probably had something to do with that. But anyway, after a few drinks, I separated myself from my friends who were sitting in one of the ship's many bars and started walking back to my room because I really wasn't feeling too well. I took some weird lower deck route back in the direction of my room though, since some of the bars were on the lowest public levels of the ship. I asked one of the maids in the hallway which way was the quickest to get to the certain section my room was in. The maid had a very thick accent, but I understood her to have said keep going straight, then make a left at the sign. So I did that. I came to a sign that I don't remember what it said, but it was a sign, so I turned left. There I was in some narrow hall with a tiled floor instead of carpeting. It didn't seem like the right way to go at all. It seemed more like an employees only section. Still, I figured I'd give it a chance before turning back, and continued down this narrow hall. I came to a corner, then looked to my right, and here was the creepiest hallway you could possibly find on this ship. Half the lights were out, one was flashing on and off, but at the end of this tiny hallway was someone standing facing the wall. My head started to hurt even more as I saw this. I had to rub my eyes to make sure what I was seeing was real, but when I moved my hands away from my eyes, the person standing by the wall was now looking at me. considering they were standing in the dark section of this hallway not lit up by lights, I couldn't really see much about their actual face, other than I knew they were looking at me. I turned and went back the direction I came. I walked back down the hall. The maid was gone now, however, so with my head still killing me, I managed to get back to the lobby of this floor, and at that point, finding the elevators was easy. I made it back to my room easily at that point and crashed into bed. I was sure I had gotten food poisoning from the sushi because my stomach was also hurting along with my head. But anyway, I woke up at some odd hour in the night and I couldn't move. The only thing I could move were my eyes. I tried looking around the room, but my inability to move my head or sit in an upright position made seeing a lot of the room difficult. Then I remember something seemed to appear in my peripheral vision. I turned my eyes to the opposite side of the room, and there was a figure facing the wall. As I looked at it, I wanted to scream or run, but I couldn't do anything. It was as real as could be, like I knew I was seeing it. Then the head of the figure turned around to face me, but all I saw was black. The body, the face, everything about this figure just looked black. The figure started to move closer to me. The most disturbing thing about it, though, was that as it moved towards me, it didn't move its limbs. It seemed to just slowly float towards me. The figure stopped over my bed, and now I could slightly see a face to it, and I recognized it as that person I saw earlier in the night in that hallway. I don't remember exactly how long that figure stood over my bed, but suddenly I saw its mouth open twice as wide as you'd expect to be humanly possible, and out came a deafeningly real scream. So loud that I think it woke me up completely from the sleep paralysis I was just in. The craziest thing I remember was the scream of this sleep paralysis figure fading into the scream of my own voice as I was finally able to make noise. I flicked on the light, and my friend, who was in the other bed, woke up asking what's wrong. I told him about the horrible experience I just had. He once again said I'd been eating way too much raw fish, and it was fucking with my head. My whole body was shaking and my voice was trembling. I went back to sleep and don't remember having another dream that night, but I still wonder if that person I saw in the hallway was real or not, because I'm 90% sure that's the hallucination I had in my paralysis. That hallucination was also the realest, most horrific thing I'd ever seen. I live on the east coast of the United States. Recently I moved to Florida from Georgia, and I figured it would take a couple days to sail my boat down there to our new waterfront house. I didn't have any cars with a tow hitch to carry the boat, let alone a trailer to carry it with, so sailing it seemed like the best option, while my wife finished up moving the rest of the stuff to our new house. I kissed my family goodbye and set sail. None of them were really willing to come with me on this adventure, and I didn't blame them. But anyway, I brought enough food and gas to last me the whole trip. The first day was a breeze. I got some sleep, then sailed for 10 hours the next day, with breaks in between, of course. By nightfall, I went to bed in the cabin. Sleeping in a rocking boat isn't exactly the easiest thing to do, so I was up for hours, rolling around on my sides trying to find a comfortable position, trying to press my head firmly enough into the pillow, thinking it would hide the unbearable feeling of the boat rocking over the ocean surface. Eventually, I heard sounds coming from above my head that I could best describe as small thumps. Did it sound like someone walking on my boat? I couldn't tell yet. With a medium-sized fishing boat floating out in the ocean, random sounds like creaks and thumps are going to be made. But these thumps were coming so rapidly and consistently, I started to get sick with the thought that someone out this far could be on my boat. I had to get out and look, but I wanted to be quiet. So I opened the cabin door very slowly, but before I could even open it all the way, I heard a big splash in the water. It sounded to me like someone or something jumped into the water. I was honestly scared I wasn't alone, even though it made no sense to me. I didn't want to go outside, but I felt I should move the boat away from whoever or whatever was out there in the water. So I ran outside to the cockpit and started the boat engine. I gave the boat some gas and got myself the hell away from there. Immediately, I heard my boat bump into something in the water. Not something heavy enough to cause any kind of impact, but heavy enough to hear it and slightly feel the boat bump. I didn't see what it was because, to be honest, I wasn't paying attention to whatever was out in the water. Plus, the lights weren't on. Anyway, I sailed for a few hours in the deep night because I was wide awake anyway. When I started to get tired, I killed the motor and went back to bed. Emphasis on the word bed, not sleep. Because even though I felt tired, I was still having trouble falling asleep. I figure half an hour passed and I started hearing more thumps. This time the thumps seemed louder and more clear for some reason. In a split second, my heart started racing again. The thumps were consistent and deliberate sounding again. No way it was just boat noises. I felt like I was being followed by someone. I couldn't just sit there and hide in the cabin like this all night. I had to sum up the courage to go outside again. But when I checked, there was no one on the entire boat. Was it my imagination? Were the sounds really just coming from the boat? I decided that must have been the case, and once again went back inside the cabin to bed. I lay there, extremely silent now, trying to listen for any little noise. And when I did this, I heard something. I knew I did. It wasn't the sound of thumping or anything like that. I had to perk up my ears to really pay attention, and I figured out what I was hearing. It wasn't the sound of the wind outside or the water hitting the boat. It was the sound of someone breathing. It was not the sound of my breathing, but someone else's. It was coming from inside the cabin, of course. I panicked, but I tried to maintain composure so to not make it obvious. I got out from the bed, walked outside the cabin, and locked myself in the cockpit. I intended on sailing until I could find a dock by the shore. There's a small window that looks into the cockpit from the cabin. It has a curtain. I turned every minute or so at least once to look back at it, expecting to see someone watching me. And one of the times I looked back, I did see someone. The curtain was curved up a little bit in the corner, and I saw someone's eye, and maybe a quarter of their face peeking into the cockpit. I turned away right away, acting like I didn't see them. I had the thought, what if it was my young son trying to scare me? But it wouldn't make sense. I saw him waving goodbye when I set sail from the house. It was 3 or 4 tense hours of hell, thinking at any moment someone could break into the cockpit and stab me, but I made it to shore and sailed through the narrow canal. I had already called the cops 15 minutes earlier, requesting they have a few officers waiting at the dock I was headed to. It was still dark out, but I saw people standing on the dock, and I couldn't have been more excited to get there. When I stopped the boat next to the dock, I came out from the cockpit screaming at the officers to help, pointing at the cabin door. The 2 officers went into the cabin with their hands on their pistols, and 10 seconds later, I heard them yelling at someone. They pulled out some guy with really long, gray, wet hair and a similar beard, wearing wet, skinny, ripped jeans and a gray t-shirt. They had him in cuffs as they walked him past me. He looked at me and just laughed this insanely off-putting laugh. The guy looked and sounded like a meth head, the best way I could describe him. The police questioned him, but he never answered anything as to how or when he got on my boat, or what he was trying to do. But thinking back, when I heard breathing in my cabin, it's likely he was hiding under my bed, and that's the most horrifying thought imaginable. By then, I was exhausted. I went back to my cabin and fell asleep right away. By late morning, I made it to the new house, and my nightmarish adventure was over. This was 4 years ago when I was an 18-year-old college student, and where I'm from, May is finals month. I spent yet another late night in the campus library until closing time, which in May is 11 p.m. instead of 10 p.m. since everyone's up late studying. I had to call an Uber to my off-campus apartment since I had arrived with a friend who left hours before me and I didn't have my car with me. I was out in the library parking lot at 11:15 when the Uber pulled up. It was a gray Toyota Camry. The driver's name was Adam. He greeted me as normal and I sat in the back seat diagonal from him. He looked to be in his mid-40s. For the first 5 minutes of the ride, there were no words exchanged between the two of us. But then he started to ask me questions. His first question was if I was a student, which seemed a rather pointless question since I was just picked up from a college library. Next he asked how my classes are going, then how old I was. I didn't like that question. I lied and said I was 23 instead of 18. At this point I noticed he would constantly look at me through the rearview mirror as he spoke, and when he would finish what he was saying, he had this weird creepy smirk on his face. His questions were getting a little too personal for someone whose sole relationship with me was supposed to be my driver for 10 to 15 minutes. He asked how my dating life at school is, and as much as I wanted to just flat out ignore his question, I said it wasn't bad. I should have lied and said I had a boyfriend, but for whatever reason I didn't think of saying that. He transitioned from questions to making comments, like that he used to be a huge cheater in college and asked if I ever cheated. I nervously laughed and said once or twice. He then made it even weirder to no surprise and asked if I'd ever cheated on a boyfriend. I said no. At this point we were stopped at a red light. I tried my best to avoid looking at the rearview mirror, but I was too curious and snuck a peek. He was looking at me. He made a comment that I was very pretty. I knew it was coming eventually, and it still was incredibly creepy. I didn't acknowledge it. There were 2 minutes left in the ride, when I noticed he made a left turn instead of a right turn at one of the intersections, so I spoke up and told him he went the wrong way. Then he said he knows, he just has to stop at his place real quick to get something. I asked him to please just drop me off first, but he insisted his house was a minute away, and apparently it was. He stopped in front of a house and said we're here. Then he turned to me and asked if I wanted to come in, saying he had alcohol and food in case I wanted to release some stress after studying. I didn't even know what to say. I wanted to get out of the car and run, but I was scared to. I said, please just take me home. He chuckled and said he'd be right back. He went into his house, and that was when I got out from the car and started to run. No, I didn't think he had plans to murder me, but something was off about him and the situation, and I just wanted to get out of there. Moments later, I felt my phone vibrate. It was a message from Adam the driver saying, you know I have your address, hot stuff. That just made me run even faster. I canceled the ride just so he wouldn't be able to contact me anymore. I made it back to my apartment in a few minutes. Running with my backpack was hard, but thank God I do my cardio. My apartment was the left side of a duplex. That Adam guy wasn't parked in front of my house by the time I got back, so I hoped maybe he just wouldn't come. I filled out a form on Uber.com titled Report a Serious Incident with a Driver, and I just gave all the details of the trip and included a screenshot of his message threatening that he had my address. Uber contacted me the next day, stating the driver was removed from the platform and should there be any further contact, that I should contact the authorities. Well, the next night when my roommate wasn't home because she was spending the night with the guy she was talking to, there was a knock at the front door followed by the doorbell. It was like 8 to 9 p.m., so it was kind of late for solicitors or anything like that. I called through the door, who is it? And a man's voice on the other side said, I found something that belongs to you. I asked, who is this and what did you find? Their response was, just open up, I'll show you. The voice was familiar. I looked through the window next to the door, and I saw Adam the Uber driver hiding to the side of the door like he was pressed flat up against the wall, and he was holding something, I couldn't tell what. I ran for my phone to call 911, and sparing them all the details, I just begged for police to get to my apartment immediately. But by the time police arrived in front of the duplex, the knocks had long since stopped. He was gone, at least off the front porch, but I imagine he saw the police cars in front of the house because he never returned after that. There was this whole following up with the Uber report and the police now, but since there was no proof that it was Adam at the front door, I couldn't even press charges. The semester was over anyway, the lease was up, and I moved back home for summer. I left no trace for that Adam guy to ever find me again. At least, I don't think I did. This story still haunts me to this day, almost every day. I used to be an Uber driver as my second job, usually late at night, like bar closing hours. It was a Saturday night around 3 a.m. I was a couple hours into my Uber driving night, and I got a call from across town to pick someone up on a street corner. In came some guy, African-American, mid-20s, he had dreadlocks. I noticed a small tattoo on his neck, but I didn't look much longer than that. I asked how his night's going, and he just grunted. Happens, not everyone's super friendly. I confirmed the address he gave me, which appeared to be a house, and he just said yeah. About a minute into the drive, he got a little aggressive and concerned that I apparently made a wrong turn because he thought I was taking a longer route. I assured him that I was just following the route that the app was giving me, and he calmed down. Like 10 seconds later, he asked me if I'm feeling lucky, and I asked, "What do you mean?" He follows that with, "I mean, how much do you value your life, son? Nobody really values what they got." I didn't like where this was going. I responded that I appreciate my life and kids every single day. He went silent after that for a while. Then he started saying some things at such a low volume that I didn't know if he was talking to me or not. So I asked, "What was that?" And he replied, "Nothing, fool, just get me to where I gotta be." I asked, "Where is it we're heading anyway?" He replied, "I just gotta take care of some unfinished business." I really didn't know what to make of that answer, but I wasn't looking to continue that conversation or dig any deeper than I had already dug. We pulled up to some corner in a rather poverty-stricken area, not an area I typically did any drop-offs or pickups. The guy said, "Ike, can you wait here for me?" I froze for a second, confused. I asked, "Do you need to ride back somewhere?" He replied, "Yeah, this'll be quick. I just gotta take care of some unfinished business first." I didn't want to drive this guy anywhere else, and I had a feeling whatever he was about to do in this house wasn't good, based on his unfinished business comment. I didn't want to be the getaway driver after some kind of fight or altercation, so I said, "Yeah, I'll be waiting here," but I had no intentions of waiting. The ride was marked as complete on my end anyway. He shut the car door and approached the house, but he wasn't approaching the front door. He went to the back of the house by the backyard. I didn't stick around after that. I drove off after about 20 seconds, slowly and quietly so he wouldn't hear me taking off. I chose to end my shift that night right then and there. I was pretty sketched out. The next day, I heard something on the news that changed a part of me forever. There were 2 people shot in their home in the town I dropped that guy off the night before. As the news report went on, they showed a picture of the suspected shooter, and it was the guy I dropped off at that house. He was apprehended fleeing the scene not too far away after neighbors reported hearing gunshots. The shooting was suspected to be gang-related. I have forever blamed myself for this partially, having been the one to drive someone with intentions of murdering people to his destination to commit his heinous act. People have told me if it wasn't me, it would have been another Uber driver, but I still can't help but feel partially to blame for this and not picking up on the red flags in that car ride. It was a stormy night, the first thunderstorm of the year. This was after my night shift ended at 4 a.m., and I had to call a lift to the train station since I didn't have my car at the time. I waited outside the place I bartended at the time, under the front patio to avoid getting soaked. A car pulled down the empty street and stopped in front of the bar. I had to check the Lyft app to ensure it was the correct car, and it was. A gray Honda Civic. I got in and greeted the driver, whose name was Sahil. I attempted to get in the front seat at first, but he told me not to and to sit in the back. That was only the second time I ever tried sitting in the front. That was before I realized it was customary to sit in the back seat. From the bar to the train station, it was about 10 minutes. The reason I was taking the train instead of just Ubering the whole way to my house is because I'd be saving about $40. The driver was going very slow, but there was nothing weird about that given the weather outside. I would expect anyone to drive cautiously in a torrential downpour like this one. The driver didn't take the highway route. He took us down the side roads. I wasn't concerned about missing my train though. I had plenty of time. I wasn't concerned until the driver said something under his breath and then pulled the car to the side of the road. I looked up from my phone to see why and saw a man in the pouring rain waving his hands in the air. I almost asked if he was stopping to pick him up, but I just observed. And yes, the man on the street got in the back passenger seat next to me. He was soaking wet. He kept his black hood on in the car. I scooted all the way over to the left. I was expecting the man and the driver to exchange some kind of words, but they didn't. Did they know each other? I had no idea what was going on. During the ride, I felt in the corner of my eyes the feeling of that man next to me looking at me. Maybe he was looking out my window, so I shot a quick half-second glance to him, but I was wrong. He was looking at me. On top of it, as the drive progressed, I started paying more attention to the route we were taking. It wasn't the right way to the train station. I tried to sneak a peek at the driver's phone screen to see if maybe he was following some incorrect route, but he seemed to have his phone on his lap, unlike most Lyft drivers who have their phones mounted on the dashboard. I politely said, "I think we're going the wrong way." He replied something in such a low tone mixed with a thick accent that I had a hard time understanding it. By the third time I asked him to repeat himself, I finally just repeated myself and said we're going the wrong way. I confirmed this by checking the map on my phone. The driver didn't acknowledge me, and I felt as though the guy next to me was inching closer every minute. He also wouldn't stop staring at me. Eventually, I asked the driver to pull over and canceled the ride. No acknowledgement. The driver was blowing stop signs, and there were no stoplights anywhere on these side roads, so I didn't really have a good time to escape, but I knew I was about to be their victim of something. This was some kind of trap, so I decided I was going to jump out of the car when I had the chance. I waited till we were on a street with woods on one side, which was perfect for me to make my escape. The car was going probably 15 to 20 miles per hour. I opened the car and jumped out. The two men screamed stuff in a different language, I'm guessing to each other. My impact with the ground was obviously painful, but I think the layer of water on the street might have cushioned my fall a little bit. The car completely stopped, and I saw the man who was next to me get out. I had to get on my feet and run into the woods. I heard him chasing after me for a little bit, but there was no shot he'd find me. I heard him yell something back to the car. It sounded like it was in Russian. Then he ran back to the car and they drove off. I immediately called an Uber instead of a Lyft this time, and this time I was brought safely to the train station. While on the train, I went ahead and filed an online police report, and then contacted Lyft and reported the driver. The next day, I also went to the police station and reported the whole incident. But here's where the bomb was dropped. There was a gray Honda Civic reported stolen just the night before. I gave them every last detail I could remember, and eventually I was on my way. I left that police station contemplating my life, and just how narrowly I may have escaped with my life. It was senior year. I had just recently started dating my fiancée Mark. We were approaching the end of the school year, and so prom was coming up. I didn't really know if I wanted to go, because I had just finally changed all of my contact info, and my family moved to a new house because of my old stalker ex Daryl, who's 4 years older than me. I was 18 and he was 22. We met when I was going through a rough time in my life. Long story, but he turned out to be a psychotic asshole. He got kicked out of the army and started doing hard drugs like heroin. I distanced myself from him as much as I could, but he was relentless. He attempted to break into my family's home at least 3 times, and I had to get a restraining order against him. But my family was worried for me, and for all of us, so we had to move to another house. The reason I was hesitant about going to prom was because I knew my ex Daryl knew about it. We used to talk about going to my prom together. Ever since our move, my friends would drive me home and make sure we weren't followed. I really lived in fear. I was scared Daryl would show up to the prom venue and try to find me. Mark has always been very understanding and supportive, and he assured me he wouldn't tell me to go to prom if he didn't think it would be safe. He made me feel comfortable with it. We and our friends went in a limousine together to the venue, which was a fancy catering hall about 30 minutes away. We all sat at our table and had food and just hung out for a while. Some people went to dance, Mark and I included, for a while. I couldn't help but be paranoid for a while that Daryl was in the building somehow. One of Mark's friends handed me a little shot bottle of vodka and told me it would calm my nerves. I drank it in the bathroom and almost threw up, but within half an hour it really did take the edge off. A few hours later, our group wanted to leave for what's called the after prom, where you basically start drinking and continuing the party elsewhere with your friends. As we walked outside of the venue to our respective rides, I saw one car parked in front of the venue that didn't have its lights on. I didn't know what Daryl drove at that point, or if he drove, but I saw someone sitting in it. They had a baseball hat on and were looking down, so I couldn't see their face. I pointed it out to Mark. He told me to relax, there's no way it's him. We got in our friend's car who was picking us up, and we drove to our friend Melissa's house who was having a little after party. The whole ride I kept looking behind us, seeing if we were being followed, but I couldn't tell because there were so many cars on the road. I remember Mark whispering to me, "Relax, everything's fine," and he held my hand, and it helped calm me down so much. We arrived to Melissa's house, and there were already people at her house. At the peak of the night, I'd say there were 20 people there, and everyone was drinking. Eventually, Mark and I wanted to go home, so Mark called his sister to come pick us up, and when she got there, we went straight out to her car. I looked around the street for any sketchy-looking cars, but didn't see anything, and at this point, I officially convinced myself I was just being paranoid. Mark's sister drove us back to their house where I would be sleeping over. It was just his mom and his sister home. His dad is a retired cop, but he was still working at the time, and he was working a late shift that night. His mom was already asleep, it was very late. Mark and I just went downstairs to his room to crawl into bed. The whole den floor of the house was his floor. It had a mini kitchen, bedroom, and living room. His floor was level with the backyard, and so it had a back door. It was a warm night, so some of the windows were cracked open. We were watching a funny movie. That was when we heard a bang on the glass door that led to the backyard. The sliding curtain was covering the door, so we couldn't see who or what did it. I shrieked, and Mark jumped up to open the curtain. No one was on the other side, but there was a post-it note slapped on the door with the word "bitch" on it. He found me. He followed me from the prom to Melissa's house to here, and he probably heard me laughing and knew I was down here. My paranoia was right all along. We went upstairs to Mark's mom's room and woke her up, then called Mark's dad and the police. Waiting for Mark's dad and the rest of the police to arrive felt like an actual eternity. When the doorbell finally rang, followed by loud knocks, Mark and his mom went to go answer the door. It was the police. I had to explain the whole story with my ex, and the restraining order, and now being followed by him here. They asked if there were any cameras on the property, to which Mark's mom said no. Then they asked me if I had any texts from him, or if perhaps I knew where he lived. I told them I didn't have his number anymore, and I had no idea where he lived anymore either. Mark's dad finally arrived on the scene. I took the post-it note from the door home with me to try and compare it to other handwriting from Daryl, and it definitely matched. Mark's dad gave me a ride to my house in his police car so that we could be sure I wouldn't be followed. During the ride home, I called our home phone and my dad picked up. I cried to him into the phone hysterically. After arriving home, my parents were waiting in the front for me. Mark's dad assured my parents we weren't followed. During this period, Mark and I couldn't go to each other's houses. Mark's parents had security cameras installed the same week, and this next part is truly unbelievable. One of the side cameras on their property picked up motion, which alerted Mark's dad's phone. He grabbed his gun and ran outside to the smell of gasoline. He followed the smell until he heard the sound of liquid being poured out of a can, and there he saw Daryl pouring out gasoline on the sides of their house. With his gun drawn, Mark's dad yelled at him to drop the can and put his hands up, and that was the moment Daryl was no longer going to be a threat to my or my loved ones' lives. I call it the sweetest justice that my future fiance's cop dad was the one to arrest my psychotic ex-boyfriend who ruined so many years of my life and had me living in worry. He was sentenced to over 30 years for his crimes, the worst of which of course was attempted arson on a police officer's house. It was 2017. I was 17 getting ready for prom. And of course, girls have it harder because instead of the guys who just rent the same tuxedos, girls have to find a nice dress that they're going to keep. And of course, prom dresses aren't cheap, if you want a nice one at least. My parents didn't want to spend over $200 for a prom dress, so my mom suggested I look online for a used one. She'd even help me. We scrolled on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, which had just become a thing back then and wasn't as popular as it is today. There wasn't really any luck on Facebook Marketplace, so we mainly searched Craigslist. We found a listing for a dress that we both liked. It was a navy blue evening gown, $50. It said it was worn once for prom. The seller lived pretty close too, so I contacted the number listed on the listing, and in under 10 minutes I got a text back. After expressing my interest and asking a couple sizing questions, the person offered to come to our house to drop it off to us. But my mom said no to having someone from Craigslist come to our house. So I said we'd come to them that day. I asked for their name and they said Alex. Honestly, I assumed that Alex was short for Alexandra. My mom offered to come with me. I felt more comfortable if she'd drive me. When we got to the address, it was a townhouse in a congested area of town. The townhouse was on a dead end. My mom asked if I wanted her to come in with me, and honestly, I don't know why, but I thought it would be embarrassing to go in with my mom. I asked her to just wait in the car unless I text her. I texted Alex, and then I went to ring the doorbell. I noticed all the blinds on the windows were closed, which was strange. It was the middle of the day. The door opened, and instead of some young girl around my age opening the door, it was an actual grown man, like 50 years old. He smiled and asked if I was here for the dress. I said, "Yeah, are you Alex?" And he said, "Yeah." He said I looked just like his daughter, and then said, "Come inside." I looked back at my mom's car and then went inside the house. He said I should be a perfect fit for the dress. He said he'd go get it, then disappeared into another room. The living room was dark and kind of messy. I took out my phone and texted my mom to come to the front door. Then the man called out from a room for me to come inside and try the dress on in front of a mirror. I asked him if he could bring the dress out to the living room. He said there's no mirror in the living room, and I replied that I'd just like to see the dress first. He left the room and entered the living room empty-handed, and said the dress is on the bed in the bedroom if I want to go look at it. I once again asked him to please just bring it out here. Then a knock at the front door. Alex said, "Who is that?" And I opened the door to my mom stepping inside. She smiled and said hello to the man, and he took a couple seconds to say hello back, but without a smile. Now I walked to the doorway of the bedroom, and as I did, he made a noise as if to say, "Don't go in there." I looked into the dark bedroom, and there was no dress on the bed. My mom was in the middle of asking a question when I interrupted and said, "There's no dress." There was a painfully uncomfortable and tense silence, and then the man said, "I'd like you to leave now." My mom and I, without hesitation, left to the car. By the time we were in the car, the front door was already closed, and I saw the man peering through the kinked blinds. We were both in shock. If my mom hadn't come in, I don't know what would have happened. I reported the Craigslist ad. We didn't call the police though, because there was really no proof of anything, and technically nothing happened. But there was no blue dress in that room. He was just trying to get me into that room, and when my mom came in, he couldn't exactly do that anymore. Thank God I listened to my mom and didn't give him our address. I ended up getting a used dress shipped to me. That prom night, I told everyone this story, and it's still kind of haunting even today. In our high school class, there was a kid named Joshua that moved to our high school during freshman year, so I guess he had a hard time breaking into any of the established friend groups. He had a few friends here and there from what I know, but he wasn't part of any particular groups. But then something really awkward happened one day during lunch. I had already asked my date Natalie to prom, and she said yes. At lunch, we had a table of mixed guys and girls, and Natalie was at the table. Here came Joshua from whatever table he was sitting at, and like an awkward scene out of a movie, he tapped Natalie on the shoulder and asked her to prom. The whole table went silent except for one kid who cheered sarcastically. Then Natalie laughed in clear discomfort and said she's already going with me. I felt the secondhand embarrassment. Joshua looked at me, and I didn't know what to think of the stare he gave me, but I could tell he was humiliated. He left without saying a word, and everyone laughed loudly. It was a horribly uncomfortable scenario all around. While I felt bad, I couldn't help but slightly laugh too. I mean, I have no idea what he thought was going to happen, especially with such a large audience of dudes at the table too. We watched as Joshua actually left the cafeteria, and the teacher on lunch duty actually chased after him because you weren't allowed to leave without a pass. But Joshua never came back into the lunchroom. I still wonder where he went from there. On prom night, we had our group of 10 in the back of the limo. The same 10 of us sat at the table together when at the dance. Everything was going as prom should. But then, eventually that night, one of my friends told me, "Don't look now, but Joshua's at that table eyeballing you." I waited like 10 seconds before looking over, and I saw Joshua shooting a dagger at, I guess, Natalie and I. I decided I'd go talk to him, but as I walked over to him, he got up and hurried away out of the dance hall. That was super weird, but I wasn't going to chase after him. I went over to the table he was sitting at and asked a couple of the kids if they came with Joshua, and they said no, he kinda just sat there randomly and wasn't saying anything. I went back to my table, and like a typical high schooler, I told the whole table. It was definitely pretty freakish. After prom, Natalie and I left with a friend who drove to go to a diner to eat a bunch of breakfast food at like 12 a.m. After that, we went to our friend Anthony's house. He had a massive backyard right next to a nature preserve, and he had a really cool fire pit. So we all circled the fire pit with a speaker playing music and some drinks. There were 6 of us total. Anthony, sitting across from me, pointed out to the woods and said he saw something in the woods. We all looked over, of course. We looked at the woods for a while, but when we didn't see anything, Anthony basically said, "Aight, whatever." We continued to hang by the fire pit for a while. Eventually one couple left, so it was just Natalie, Anthony, his date, and myself left. Anthony was mid-sentence when he stopped speaking abruptly. I said, "What?" and I turned around and saw someone walking towards the light of the fire from the woods. It was someone in a tuxedo. He said to us, "Don't get up." As he got closer, we realized it was Joshua. He was holding a hatchet or small axe. He looked like he had been crying, but he also looked angry. Anthony and I told him to please put the axe down and just talk. Joshua yelled at us to shut up, and he made us turn the music off. He began a rant about how soul-crushingly embarrassing what happened during lunch that day was, and how he had been too embarrassed to come back to school after that because he thought it had been spread all over the school, but it really hadn't, and we tried to tell him that. Anytime we tried to speak, he'd scream "shut the fuck up" louder and louder, and he'd begin to raise the axe, kind of. He then directed his attention to Natalie and started going on about how he thought she was gorgeous, and that she would only make fun of him with her friends, which again, that never happened. All these things only happened in his head. During this time that he was talking to Natalie, Anthony was low-key and texted his dad something like "bring the gun to the backyard," making it clear we were in danger. Anthony's dad came out to the back door and yelled, "What's going on?" with his gun in his hand. Joshua stopped talking, and I could see he was deciding in his head whether to run or not. He dropped the axe and ran back to the woods. Anthony's dad came running over with his gun, and we all 4 of us couldn't tell him what happened quick enough. His dad said not to touch the axe, leave the fingerprints on it for the police. That hatchet, axe, whatever, was eventually the key to prosecuting Joshua after a few days. Joshua had already been arrested, and so his fingerprints were in the system, and they matched the fingerprints on the axe. But when all 4 of us decided we didn't want to press charges on Joshua, it was too late. By that point, he got charged criminally. Anthony's friend said it was for menacing in the 2nd degree. He didn't serve any jail time. I found Joshua on Facebook shortly after this and reached out to him with a sincere message, not attacking him at all, and he read it. He never replied to it. I saw Joshua one other time in the halls that year. He didn't look at me. None of us ever saw him again after graduation. My cousin Tyler and I used to have sleepovers all the time when we were kids. Always at his house though, because he had the cool house. Back then, before cell phones and modern video games, kids actually used to do normal kid things, like for example, we both loved to play hide and seek at night. One time when we were 9, both our parents were going out for a night in Atlantic City, so they had my other cousin, Tyler's older brother Joe, keep watch on us. An hour into the night, however, Joe told both of us he was going out and not to tell Mom. Tyler and Joe would commonly do this because it mutually benefited them. Tyler loved having the house to himself, and Joe hated staying home all night. By the time he left, it was already a little later in the night, like 9 o'clock. We had our dinners and decided it would be a good idea to play hide and seek. Their house was honestly massive, so it was always a lot of fun.
I was hiding first. We started in the basement where Tyler would count. We had a rule that we couldn't use any house lights, only flashlights. Our reason for this was because it just made it cooler. I tiptoed up the stairs, then up the next flight of stairs to the upstairs of the house. The upstairs had a whole other living area, along with 3 bedrooms. I chose to hide in one of the unused bedrooms. I buried myself between 2 big beanbag chairs and a blanket. I left the door open to avoid any suspicions. I heard creaking coming into the room, lively footsteps. Tyler was now moving around the carpeted room. I could hear him. He went over to the closet and opened it. Then he opened the second closet. Silence. Then he walked over to the other side of the room, and he started opening the drawers to the desk, rummaging through them. Suddenly I heard Tyler's young, innocent voice calling my name up the stairs in a kind of mockingly tone to try and scare me. My mouth opened and literally started twitching when I put 2 and 2 together. I lifted the blanket slightly over my head to see what he was doing, but it wasn't Tyler. I knew right away based off the person's height. It was a much taller, fully grown man. It wasn't Joe, and it wasn't his dad. He perked up like a statue when he heard Tyler's voice, and I saw him duck into the corner of the room, behind the small piece of wall that sticks out there. Tyler entered the room with his flashlight and kept saying my name over and over, slow and drawn out like. I was praying his light would not reach over to the corner of the room. His light landed on me under the blanket. He may not have even seen me, but I still willingly came out and acted all defeated, fake laughing and everything. I told him he won, put my arm around his back, and started nudging him out of the room. I kept the conversation as natural as possible, until we were halfway down the stairs. That's when I dropped the bomb and told him there was someone in there with me and nudged him to run outside. Being the scared 9-year-olds we were, all we could do was run next door and ask the woman living there to call the police for us. She did without hesitation. I still remember the scene vividly, of the cops pulling up, running into the house, and 5 minutes later ushering a guy out in cuffs. It was a great feeling, even as a 9-year-old. One time I had a sleepover with my friend Mike on a cloudy, dark night. There was a slight drizzle and occasional lightning. We were 13 years old. Mike lived on a dead end with one other house next to it. Across the street was a field surrounded by trees, and his backyard led to a forest. Mike and I were up late, much after his dad went to sleep. His dad's room was all the way upstairs. Mike's room was on the lower level of the house by the den, so the den was where we would hang out mostly to just play GameCube. A knock at the backyard window interrupted our game. The blind was shut, so we couldn't see outside. Mike ran to go open the blind. I told him not to, but he did anyway. As he did, I shut off the TV and lamps because I didn't want to be seen. Now that it was dark in the den and slightly brighter outside, we could slightly see outside and see that there was nothing but grass in the visible distance. A small flash of lightning confirmed that there was nothing but wet grass in all directions. We sat in the den with the lights off for a while, just waiting for something else to happen. We kept our eyes on the window, expecting somebody to come up to it. Eventually, after what felt like forever later, we turned the TV and lamp back on and pretended it didn't happen. The blinds were open this time, and every so often I'd take nervous glances at the window, just making sure nobody was out there. After getting so absorbed in the game and forgetting to take a glance at the window, there was the second set of knocks. Mike and I both jumped up and looked at each other. With all the lights on, we couldn't really see outside. At least, not until the flash of lightning outside, just for a brief moment, lit up the night sky, long enough to show the person who was standing at the window. This time we ran upstairs to Mike's dad's room and pulled him out of bed, screaming at him to get up. The three of us ran out to the backyard in our coats and shoes, turning the backyard light on the way and also taking along flashlights. There was a buildup of mud next to the back wall of the house where the dirt patches were, and in the puddles of mud were heavy, distinct footprints of boots. We followed the footprints as far as we could, but as the mud faded away, so did the footprints. We searched high and low for anybody. We even went around front and then out into the woods. There was nobody. We all went to sleep, Mike and I in the den. I couldn't sleep though, I was terrified. Of course, the blinds were shut to the window and back door now. Just as I was anticipating it, there was a third set of knocks at exactly 12:15. I remember that number. Me and Mike both jumped from the couches and ran upstairs to his dad's room once again. This time he ran outside alone and told us to call the cops. He returned soaking wet, having found nobody. The cops came for nothing because there was really nothing they could do. The knocking didn't happen again though, and I also never slept over Mike's house again. Ever since that day, his den just always gave me the creeps. I used to be close friends with a kid named Chris. He moved away across the state when I was 8. Since we never got to see each other anymore, I got my mom to agree to drive me all the way over to Chris's new house in the country for a weekend sleepover. Pulling onto his property, I already knew this was the perfect place to do anything outdoorsy. It was a decent-sized house with nothing but woods in all directions. The first day we didn't do much because I got there late anyway, so we just talked for a while and watched a movie. A couple of times I'd think that I was hearing sounds coming from below the floor. I would ask him, "Do you have a basement? Is someone down there?" Chris went on to tell me that there was no basement and that his whole family had been hearing weird noises coming from down there for a few days, and they planned on having some inspector over to check it out. The next day was partly cloudy and warm, so we planned on spending most of the day outside. I convinced him to go for a walk in the woods just to explore. After all, this was all kind of new to him as well. Conveniently, there was an opening into the woods that almost seemed to have meant to be a path. So as we were walking over to it, Chris's foot hit something that made a metallic kind of thud sound. His foot hit a rusty old cellar door. He said he didn't know about this, neither did his dad. He bent down and pulled it open, and it made an ear-piercing squeal as the rusty door turned on the hinges. It was the definition of pitch black down there, but it seemed a ladder led down a very narrow tunnel. Neither of us dared to step foot down there. Suddenly, a sound echoed up the tunnel, like the sound of something dropping onto a hard floor. And then metallic sounds echoing up the tunnel, getting closer. As soon as we realized it was the sound of somebody climbing up the ladder, we ran to get Chris's father, who was shocked to see what we had found. He called down there repeatedly for anybody to come out before calling a few of his buddies over to go down with him. Chris and I were forced to stay inside while the three of them went down there. They came back up 5 minutes later, all of them visibly shaken and nervous. They came back inside and talked to Chris's mom in private. They never let either of us in on what they saw. Apparently cops showed up as well, but we were forced to stay in Chris's room, so we couldn't watch any of it. In fact, it wasn't until I was 13 that Chris finally texted me one day, telling me what his dad really found down there. 3 full body bags tucked away in a corner, an old cot, broken beer bottles everywhere, and the smell of freshly smoked pot. Chris told me that when we heard something down there, we probably heard whoever was living down there, and whoever was responsible for those dead bodies.
Aren't you tired of hoping the right candidates see your job posts and apply? It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
So to start, my family history is very tragic. My parents got into a serious car accident when I was a little kid, and my dad passed away in the hospital from his injuries. My mom had lasting injuries that still affect her, making it difficult for her to walk. My dad left us the house that my mom and I continued to live in for many years to come. Eventually, my mom started seeing someone when I was around 10, so she'd be out of the house quite often. My uncle Steve would often stay at the house for days at a time while she was gone, and I got really close with him. He was my babysitter of sorts for a long time. He was always a cool uncle. He'd play catch with me in the yard, he'd take care of our pets, he'd take me to the movies, stuff like that any kid needs. Memories I didn't get to form with my dad, unfortunately. As the years went on and I got older, my mom got married to her second husband, and my uncle Steve would come around less and less. By the time I was 16, there was a period where he just didn't come over for months and I didn't hear from him. My mom was comfortable leaving me home alone at this point, so I didn't question it too much, and having the house to myself was always nice as a teenager. My mom would be home a couple nights a week for dinner, but for the most part, she lived with her husband. My mom was always very vague about what happened to my Uncle Steve. I had my suspicions that he was sick or dead, though. It may sound weird that my mom would hide something like that from me, but if you met my mom, you'd get it instantly. Because of what she went through, I think it made her a much more compassionate person that doesn't want to cause any kind of stress or grief toward another person. By the time I turned 18, I was a legal adult and the house was basically mine. My mom would visit occasionally, but she and her husband had already gotten another house together. As an 18-year-old guy having a house to myself, you could imagine that I wasn't complaining. Yes, I'd have friends over for late nights, yes, I'd have girls over, and yes, I'd often not pick things up off the floor for days at a time. I would miss my Uncle Steve though, as he was the father figure that I grew up with, and there were times where being in a big empty house by myself at such a young age was kind of lonely and depressing. I would numb this feeling often by, I guess, doing the things I just mentioned, having girls over and late nights with friends. I still had my dog Jojo, the only other life in the house really. He was an Australian Shepherd, and at the time of this story, he was 13 years old. He was an old man. He always slept by my side in bed, but one night in January, I remember this because the Christmas tree was still up, I woke up and Jojo wasn't in bed. I got up thinking he was downstairs somewhere and he had to go to the bathroom. I called his name as I walked down the stairs. I didn't hear him, so I walked to the kitchen where the basement stairs and back door were, and I saw him in the dark. He was staring intently down the basement stairs. I usually left that door open because it was a bitch to close. He only moved when he turned his head to look at me for a second, but then he looked right back down the stairs. I stepped to the edge of the stairs and then looked at Jojo and said, "What is it, boy?" His tail started wagging just a bit for a second, then went stiff again. I flicked on the light in the basement and looked down the stairs. Jojo inched closer but didn't bark. I felt a cold shiver run down me as I looked down into the basement. Of all places for your dog to stare down like this, the basement is the worst place. I turned off the light and grabbed Jojo by the collar to bring him upstairs. I shut the door so he couldn't leave again. Was I creeped out? Yes, a little. It was unusual behavior for him. I was mainly asking myself what he could have heard. I tried to go back to sleep. At this point, my mind was kind of racing though, and it didn't help that every few minutes or so, I would hear and feel the vibration on the bed as Jojo would look up at the doorway, as if still hearing something from downstairs. I decided I would investigate. I wasn't going to be a mama's boy and text my mom at whatever off hour in the night it was telling her I'm scared. Part of not having a father figure in the house when you're young is becoming a man early on. I went downstairs again, and by the time I was at the bottom, I heard Jojo walking down following me. Jojo then caught up to me and went straight for the basement door again. Then he stopped in the same position as last time. I stopped alongside him and looked down the stairs to the darkness again. I can't believe I did this, but I called down the stairs, saying, "Is someone there?" I flicked on the light when there was no response. I started walking down the steps, each one creaking beneath me. I hated those old steps. You couldn't see into the basement until you were about halfway down the stairs, as the ceiling was low. I was on maybe the third step when I heard the voice. It was my uncle's voice. I knew it right away, all these years later. It was my uncle's voice from somewhere in the basement, saying my name, only it sounded weak, like he was injured. I ran down to the basement as my heart dropped out of me. I got to the bottom, and it was just an empty basement. "Uncle Steve?" I called out. Jojo was still at the top of the stairs looking down at me. He didn't want to come down. I walked further into the basement, and there was nobody there. My heart was beating 100 beats per minute at this moment. I peeked behind the couch, and even behind the TV. There was nowhere else for anyone to be besides the laundry room, which was in the corner. I took one look into the corner, and I thought I heard the slightest sound on the other side of the door. That's when something just came over my entire body, where I had to sprint upstairs like a little kid and get out of there. When I got to the top step, I didn't even shut the light. I struggled to just close the basement door and then run upstairs. Poor old Jojo barked the first barks I'd heard from him in months. He followed behind as fast as he could as I went upstairs. First thing I did was lock us in my room. Then I called my mom over and over until she picked up. When she did, I was whisper screaming into the phone, telling her someone's down in the basement, and it sounded just like Uncle Steve. In fact, I knew it was Uncle Steve. I told her that Jojo was at the basement door when I woke up, after he obviously heard something too. My mom was surprisingly calm and just let me finish. When I finished, I waited for her to say something in panic or anything, but she just said in a gentle, calm voice that I probably just woke up from a bad dream. I doubled down and swore to her that someone was down there. Even Jojo knew it. I asked her if she thought I would just make that up. This is where she paused for a second, and it's because this was the moment she decided to tell me the truth, that my Uncle Steve got sick with cancer and died years ago, and that's why he stopped coming over. Before she could finish her explanation, I told her it's not possible. He's down in the basement right now. She then stopped me and said, "Listen to me. If someone's in the basement, you need to call the cops right now." So that's what I did. I hung up, dialed 911, and told them of a break-in. Jojo and I waited in my bedroom until there was a knock at the front door, followed by the doorbell. I ran downstairs to let them in and eagerly pointed them to the basement. The basement door was still basically jammed shut like I left it. They told me to wait up there, but I didn't listen. I insisted on going down with them. I reenacted everything as we went down, what I heard, when, and where. Then I showed them where I looked around, and then I pointed to the one spot I didn't check, the laundry room, where I heard the sound. They went to open the door, and I showed them the light switch. When the light turned on, there was no one inside. The laundry room looked how it always looked. There was no one hiding in any secret crevices or behind the machines, nothing. It was as void of people as could be before we came in. I knew I was looking crazy right about now. We went back upstairs, and they did a little search of the first floor as well, then the upstairs. The house was as clear as it could be. There was no one there. They were at least pretty level-headed and not demeaning about it, even though they probably thought I was a whack job. They left, and I went back upstairs to call my mom again. She picked up right away, and this is where she finished explaining. My Uncle Steve died years ago, but she didn't want to tell me because she knew I suffered enough loss, and she couldn't bring herself to tell me. So she just played it off like my uncle kinda disappeared, which I yelled at her was infinitely worse, but that also didn't explain my hearing his voice just now in the basement. I calmed down, and then said into the phone, "Mom, I'm scared." She believed what I heard, I know it, and that scared me even more. She tried to convince me everything would be alright, and that my brain was playing tricks on me. I pretended to agree. We hung up, and I pulled Jojo close to me. He was the only thing keeping me from freaking out of my skin that night. I didn't fall asleep for another few hours. For a whole week after that, life in that house was hell. I couldn't go anywhere near that basement door. Jojo wouldn't stare at it anymore, but it was still haunting. I know it was all real because Jojo was reacting to something. Had Jojo not been there, I could have played it off as a late-night hallucination or mind tricks. But no, someone or something was down there. Something that had my uncle's voice. My mom sold that house just a year later. This happened when I was 24 and renting the upstairs of an old house by myself. It wasn't technically an apartment, it was more like the second floor had been turned into its own little living space years ago. There was a bedroom, bathroom, tiny kitchen, and a living room, and the landlord lived out of state, so I almost never saw him. The first floor was empty and had been for months because he was supposedly renovating it before renting it out again. That part always made me a little uneasy because it meant every night I was sleeping above a completely dark, empty floor of the house. Still, the rent was cheap, and I told myself I was being dramatic. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. Then one night around 1 in the morning, while I was in bed doom scrolling, I heard what sounded like a single footstep directly below me. It was so clear that I actually froze and waited for another one. A few seconds later, I heard another. It sounded exactly like someone slowly walking through the first floor living room. I sat up in bed and just listened. I remember thinking maybe it was the house settling, but it didn't sound like that. Old house noises usually had more of a creak or a pop to them. This sounded heavier, like actual weight pressing on floorboards. I stayed still for a long time, then finally convinced myself it had to be nothing. The next day, I checked the first floor on my way out. It was locked. I even opened it and looked inside. The place was empty and dusty, with no furniture except for an old broken table in one room. I felt stupid for being unsettled. The next night, nothing happened. The night after that, it happened again. This time, it started at around 12:30. It was the same thing. Slow footsteps below me. 3 or 4 at a time, then silence, then a few more. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. I muted my TV and stood in the middle of my living room listening down through the floor. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe an animal got in. Maybe pipes somehow sounded like that in this house. But deep down, I knew it sounded like a person moving around. I texted my friend Scott about it, and he made a joke that the downstairs tenant had finally moved in. Over the next week, it kept happening. It was always late at night and always from downstairs. Sometimes it was footsteps, but once it sounded like a cabinet door shutting. That was the first time I got genuinely scared enough to call the landlord. He sounded annoyed more than concerned. He said no one had keys except him and me, and he was out of state. He told me old homes make weird noises, and said if I was really nervous, I could call the police, but he didn't think there was any reason to. That response actually made me more uncomfortable, because now I felt like if something was wrong, I was on my own. One Friday night, I was out later than usual, and didn't get home until almost 2. The second I stepped into my upstairs apartment, I felt something was off. I don't know how else to explain it. Nothing looked different, and the lights were off like I'd left them, but something felt different. I stood for a second listening, and everything was quiet, but then directly below me, I heard a thud. It sounded like something had bumped into a wall or a piece of furniture downstairs. I backed up so fast I almost tripped on the rug. I remember just standing there staring at the floor like I could somehow see through it. Then came more footsteps. I left immediately and sat in my car with the doors locked. I actually called the police that time. 2 officers came and checked the whole first floor and outside of the house. They found nothing. One of them said there was no sign of forced entry and no one inside. He was polite about it, but I could tell they both thought I had gotten worked up over house noises. For the next few days, I kept thinking maybe they were right. Then I started noticing little things. Once, I came home from work and the first floor door was open by maybe an inch. I knew I closed it after the police were there. Another time, I smelled cigarette smoke outside the side of the house near one of the downstairs windows. I don't smoke, and neither do any of my nearby neighbors, at least not from what I knew. Then one night, I heard the footsteps again, only this time they stopped directly beneath my bedroom. I was lying in bed, and it sounded like whoever it was standing still in the room below me. I held my breath and listened. After maybe 10 seconds, I heard a very light tapping sound. 3 taps, then silence. I can't explain the feeling going through my body at that point. It felt like I was being watched in that moment, even though that made no logical sense. I grabbed my phone and texted my friend asking if I could come stay at his place. While I was waiting for him to answer, I heard the tapping again. 3 more taps in the same spot. I left without even changing clothes. The next day, my friend came back with me because I didn't want to be there alone. We checked the whole place and again found nothing, but when we got to the downstairs kitchen, he crouched near one of the lower cabinets and said, "What is that?" There was a cigarette butt jammed way in the back under the cabinet toe kick, almost hidden. It looked fresh. That instantly made everything real for me. Somebody had been in there. At that point, I stopped caring if I sounded paranoid. I called the landlord again and told him exactly what we found. He seemed more concerned this time and said he'd drive over the next day. That night, I stayed somewhere else. When he got there the following afternoon, he called me and said there was nothing obvious, but one of the back windows downstairs didn't lock right. It looked closed, but from outside it could be forced up enough for a thin person to get in. He said maybe somebody local had figured that out and was using the empty first floor when no one was around. Hearing that made me feel sick. I asked him if he was going to fix it right away, and he said yes, but I'd already decided I was done. What really pushed me over the edge happened that same evening when I went back one last time to get some clothes and my laptop. I was upstairs stuffing things into a duffel bag when I heard a sound come from below that I hadn't heard before. It was a cough, and there was no mistaking it. It came from the first floor hallway. For about 2 seconds, I just stood there digesting what I just heard. Then I grabbed the bag and ran out so fast I left half my stuff there. I called the cops again from my car. This time they actually found evidence someone had been coming in. Near the back window, there were fresh marks and dirt on the sill, and in a closet downstairs, they found an old blanket I had never seen before. I moved out that weekend. Ever since then, any sound in the house at night hits me differently. My name is Chris, and this happened when I was 22. I was living in the upstairs of a mother-daughter house owned by our parents, with my older brother Tom living downstairs. The setup was pretty simple. My part of the house upstairs was one big open space for the living room, kitchen, and dining area, then a hallway that led to the bathroom, a spare bedroom I used as a big walk-in closet, and my bedroom at the end. Tom had his own separate entrance downstairs, and we had a door that connected the 2 floors from inside. It worked out well because we had our own space but could still get to each other if needed. One week, Tom went to Mexico with his fiancée, so I had the whole place to myself. The night in question started completely normal. I got home around 7, threw something on TV, and started cooking dinner. Chicken and rice, something simple that didn't require much attention. I had the TV going in the background, and everything was normal. Around the time I was cleaning up, I thought I heard a noise from downstairs. I'm not sure how to describe it other than just a basic thud. Like it could have came from the wall, on the floor, I don't know. Just a thud. I stopped what I was doing and listened for a bit. I assumed it was something settling or something falling over slightly. The normal assumptions. The downstairs had been empty for a few days already since Tom left. Still, it felt random enough that I muted the TV and stood there for a bit. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't like the feeling of ignoring it. So I went over to the door that led downstairs, which was already open, and went down to check. I turned on the lights and walked through every room. His living room, kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom. Everything looked exactly how it should. So I went back upstairs, finished cleaning, put everything away, and then sat on the couch for a while watching TV. After maybe an hour or so, I got tired and decided to go to bed. It didn't take long for me to start drifting off. Then, out of the blue, I heard music start playing from the living room. It was loud enough to instantly wake me up. It took me a second to even process what I was hearing. It was coming from my Amazon Alexa on the counter in the kitchen area. The song itself was some kind of slow instrumental song I had never heard before. It had a sort of dark vibe to it. I yelled Alexa stop from my bed a couple times, but it didn't respond. I got more annoyed than anything and got out of bed, went into the hallway, and said Alexa stop louder. The music shut off right away. I looked at it for a second, pretty much knowing it was likely just a glitch. I went back into my room and got back into bed. A few minutes later, just as I was starting to fall asleep again, I heard the Alexa say, "Sorry, I didn't quite get that."
I'm having trouble understanding.
I got up again, walked into the living room, and unplugged it from the wall completely. I remember thinking that would be the end of it. Clearly that confirmed the thing was glitching out. I went back to my room, and this time I fell asleep pretty quickly. I don't know how much time passed, but I woke up suddenly to loud music again. It took me a second to even understand what was happening because I was still half asleep. Then it hit me. The music was coming from the living room again. I shot out of bed immediately because I remember unplugging the Alexa. There was no way it should have been on. I walked down the hallway slower this time. I didn't know what I was expecting to see, but I felt very uncomfortable now. I called out, "Alexa, stop," as I got closer, and the music shut off instantly. I then looked at the counter. The Alexa was plugged back into the wall. I just stood there staring at it for a few seconds. You would too if you were in the same situation. I knew without a doubt I unplugged it, unless I sleepwalked and plugged it back in. I remember pulling the cord out myself. There was no doubt about that. That's when that feeling in your stomach that something's really wrong hit me. I didn't check anything else because I was too scared. I turned and went straight back to my room and locked the door. Thank God it had a lock. I grabbed my phone and texted Tom asking if he came back early and was messing with me. But as I was typing, I saw at the top of the screen under his name, it said, "Location Mexico." If this didn't already seem weird, now this felt straight up like a nightmare. I pulled the chair over to the door so I could sit and listen for anything on the other side. I didn't hear anything at first. Everything was completely quiet. I stayed like that for probably 10 minutes with my ear up on the door. Then I heard something that I will never forget. From out in the living room, I heard a whisper. It was quiet, but clear enough to understand what it was. It said, "Alexa, play," and then something I couldn't make out. My entire body went numb. It was like all the weight dropped out of me at once. Before I could react, the Alexa responded, and music started blasting again from the living room. I don't think I've ever felt that kind of dreadful fear before. I grabbed my phone and called 911, but instead of being quiet about it, I just started yelling that I was calling 911 and telling whoever was out there to get the F out. I don't know why I did that. I think I just panicked. I was 22, scared, and defenseless. My first priority wasn't getting this person arrested, rather just getting them out. The music was so loud I couldn't hear anything else. I had no idea if the person was still out there or not. The operator answered, and I told them someone was in my house. When the song finally ended, I yelled, "Alexa, stop," again from inside my room. It worked. The cops showed up a few minutes later. I stayed in my room until they were inside and calling my name. When I came out, I explained everything as best I could. They checked the entire upstairs and then went downstairs too. After a few minutes, they came back and said there was no one in the house. I don't know if that made me feel good or bad. Good on one hand that the danger was gone, bad on the other that they got away. One of them told me that my front door was wide open when they got there. That front door was without a doubt locked, at the very least closed. That meant whoever it was had left through there, but it didn't explain how they got in. The officers eventually left after telling me to call again if anything else happened. I locked the front door, locked the door to the downstairs, and didn't sleep much the rest of that night. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about something. The downstairs apartment had been empty for days while Tom was gone. There was a part of me that couldn't shake the idea that someone might have been staying down there and just came upstairs that night to harass me and scare me. That thought bothered me more than anything else that actually happened, so I stayed at a friend's place the next night. When Tom got back 2 days later, I had already told him everything. We went through both parts of the house again and didn't find anything obvious missing or out of place. My brother only believed me because I showed him proof of the police having come there. Otherwise, he'd have thought it was a joke to scare him. The first thing we did was install cameras around the house, front, back, and inside by both doors. Nothing like that happened after that. Eventually, our parents made us get our own apartment so they could rent that house out for extra income. In a weird way, I was happy to get out of there because when something like this happens, it sticks with you, and it becomes attached mentally to that place where it happened. I'll choose to be anonymous with this because it's pretty embarrassing, and also putting my name out there tied to this is likely a horrible idea. There was a Craigslist ad posted in 2017 by a guy named Jackson. He was advertising free lodging for a girl who would watch over his house and clean, basically an au pair or nanny without having to watch any kids. I'll just be honest that I kinda lost the will to do a lot when I was 21. I had zero relationship with my parents or sister, and I only had a handful of friends who I could trust. I dropped out of college my first year, part of the reason my parents hated me for a while, and I was working a dead-end job at a vape shop. I like to just refer to this period as my attitude era, and when I saw Jackson's Craigslist ad, it really caught my attention. It had like 10 pictures of his house. It looked like a modest middle-class house, slightly old-fashioned honestly, but I was into that. The pictures weren't what got my attention the most though. It was the fact that free living was offered for a nanny-type position. No background check required. I didn't even ask my family or friends their opinion on this post before I just decided to reply to it. Like I said, I wasn't exactly talking to my parents or sister at the time anyway. I texted the number on the ad, and this Jackson guy responded within a few minutes. I expressed interest in the listing and just asked some basic questions. He had an answer to everything that honestly made me feel more interested, but he asked pretty early on in the conversation what my gender was. When I said female, it almost seemed as though his responses got longer. I honestly didn't care. Most people tend to prefer having a female housekeeper or nanny anyway. I was still interested. Anything that got me out of my parents' house. He said he wouldn't be home most of the time during the day, but he wanted to come home to a clean house, and that he also wouldn't mind coming home to a cooked meal from time to time after work. Honestly, I was cool with that too. If it meant free housing, hell yeah, I'll cook some food. Beat standing in the wage cage at the vape shop. Plus, he also said he'd pay for the groceries. It was sounding almost too good to be true. He suggested I come by later that day to check the place out and see if it's a fit. I said okay. A few hours later, I was on my way in my crappy little Civic to the guy's house. It was in a perfectly normal side of town. The block actually seemed pretty calm and peaceful. The neighboring houses had flowers and decorations outside, suggesting the neighbors were normal too. Good start so far. I went to ring the bell, and when the door opened, I was greeted by a man larger and honestly older than I had pictured. I had pictured this regular 45-year-old dad-looking guy. Instead, it was a man maybe 60 years old, 6 feet tall, gray beard, and a little overweight. He greeted me with a smile and went in for a hug even though we had just met, and honestly, the amount that he laughed made me feel pretty at ease. He showed me around the house. It was a 2-story house. The first floor was your basic kitchen, dining room, and living room setup. Then the upstairs was 4 bedrooms and a bathroom. He only showed me the guest room that I'd be using and the bathroom upstairs though. The other doors stayed closed. He said if I ever needed to use the office across the hall, I was welcome to. Down the hall was his room and another room that he didn't explain. I was surprised to hear there was only 1 bathroom. Then there was the basement. He said it was unfinished and that he doesn't use it for anything other than working out and doing laundry. That was the end of the tour. He didn't show me the backyard that day. I told him I wanted the job, and he told me I was hired. 2 days later, I came back with my stuff. I told my parents I got an apartment when they asked where I was going. I didn't explain anything more. The first night there was when I noticed the cameras. No, they weren't hidden. At least, I don't think they were supposed to be. They were just small black cameras mounted up in the corners of the living room and the kitchen. It made perfectly normal sense to me. He was letting basically a stranger live in his house. It wasn't that crazy that he'd want some security. Still, I wish he had mentioned it. That was the first time I felt even slightly weird about the situation. If you can't tell, I really wanted this to work out. That night when I went to bed, I noticed how much noisier the house felt than when we toured it. I could hear the wood floors creaking every once in a while. At one point, I swear I heard what sounded like a door closing somewhere downstairs. I checked my phone, and it was around 1:30 in the morning. Again, I came up with a reason for this in my head. When you're laying in silence trying to sleep, you pick up on more sounds than you would when occupied by something during the day. Plus, every old house makes sounds like that. The next morning, he was already gone like he said he would be. He had left a note on the counter with a list of things he wanted done. It was normal stuff. He wanted me to do his laundry, vacuum the floors, wipe down the kitchen, and stuff like that. I tried to just focus on the fact that I wasn't standing behind a vape counter all day anymore. I did his laundry first, then I cleaned the floors and wiped everything down. After that, I went back upstairs and started setting up the bedroom more like my own space. I unpacked my clothes, set up my laptop on a small desk, and put a few personal things around just to make it feel less temporary. I remember thinking maybe this could actually work out. I was actually being positive. After I finished everything, I just relaxed for a while and watched YouTube videos on my laptop. Not hearing my parents yelling downstairs or having one of them burst through my bedroom door barking orders at me was a breath of fresh air. The first week actually went pretty normal. At night when he got home, we would talk a little, like about basic stuff. It never really got deep. He asked about where I grew up, what I wanted to do eventually, stuff like that. I cooked dinner a few nights in a row, and he seemed to appreciate it. I started thinking maybe I just overreacted about the cameras and the weird feeling, but it didn't all stay happy and peachy. One night, I made pasta with chicken and some vegetables. I tried my best, but I'm not some housewife-type star chef. I was some young, angsty goth girl. When he got home, he looked tired and irritated. He took one bite and his whole face changed. He said it tasted bland. I said sorry and offered to add some seasoning or make something else, but he just kind of snapped. He said something like if I was going to be living there for free, the least I could do was learn how to cook something edible. He pushed the plate away and stood up. Then he told me to clean up the mess I made in his kitchen before he walked away toward his bedroom. It caught me completely off guard. It wasn't even just what he said, it was how fast his personality seemed to change. He had seemed so easygoing before that. I cleaned everything up quietly and hoped that he had just had a bad day and nothing more. Everyone has bad days. The next morning, I actually apologized to him. I didn't even really think I did anything wrong, but I wanted to keep things smooth. I told him I was sorry about dinner and I'd try harder. He just laughed like it was nothing. Then he said something that made everything weird. He said maybe I could make it up to him by cleaning the house in my underwear that day. He said it with a smile like it was supposed to be funny. I remember just kind of freezing for a second because I didn't know how to respond. I told him I wasn't comfortable with that, to put it lightly. He just laughed again and said he was joking and told me to relax, and then he went to bed. I remember standing there after he left feeling really unsettled. It was the first time I really thought maybe there was something off about him beyond just being moody. That was the first time I texted one of my close friends about what was going on. I told her about the living situation and what he said. She immediately told me I was insane for staying there. She told me to leave as soon as possible. I didn't want to though. As weird as it was getting, I still felt like I had more control over my life there than I did living with my parents. Going back there felt like failing again. The next Monday, I was leaving the house to go buy groceries with some money he had left for me. As I was driving, a car behind me started laying on the horn. I thought I did something wrong driving, but it kept following me. I pulled over because I started getting scared that something was really wrong. The car pulled up behind me and a girl got out. She looked around my age. She walked up to my window and asked if I was living at that house. When I said yes, she immediately told me I needed to stay away from that man. Apparently, Jackson wasn't even his real name. She said she was the girl who had the same arrangement before me. She told me she eventually realized he had cameras watching her constantly. She said she started noticing he knew things he shouldn't know. She said when she tried to leave, he made it very difficult and kept asking questions about where she was going and when she was coming back. Then she told me one night she woke up and saw him leaving her bedroom. That part made me physically sick. Then she told me the worst part. She said he didn't even have a job. She said he lied about going to work every day, and she eventually realized he was still somewhere inside the house most days. I just sat there trying to process it. Every little weird thing suddenly started making sense. I asked her how I could leave without causing problems. She told me to act completely normal, to start slowly taking important things out so he wouldn't notice. She said when I leave, I should make it look like I was just running errands, and she told me not to confront him and not to let him know I knew anything. After she left, I just sat in my car for a few minutes trying to calm down before going back. When I walked back into the house, it felt completely different. I felt like I was being watched even more than before. That night, I checked the room carefully like she suggested. She was right. After a few minutes of looking around, I noticed something small on the top shelf of the closet. It was pushed away into the corner. When I moved a box, I saw a tiny black lens pointing outward through a small drilled hole. I just slowly put the box back like I didn't see it. Needless to say, I didn't sleep at all that night. I looked at the darkness of the room, wondering what I'd gotten myself into, and honestly, I'm glad I didn't fall asleep that night, because at some random crazy hour in the night, I heard my door creak open, and I flipped to my side and looked at the door. It was Jackson. He noticed me look at him, and he apologized for waking me and closed the door. What the actual was that weirdo planning on doing? I needed to get out of there. The next morning, I started my plan. Every day, I would bring one small bag of stuff to my car. Just normal things and nothing obvious. 3 days later, I left while he was at work, and I never came back. Though if what that girl told me were true, who knows where he actually was? Maybe in the house somewhere. He texted me later asking where I was. I told him I decided to move back home and thanked him for the opportunity. He kept texting asking why and saying I should at least come talk to him in person. I never responded again. About a week later, I noticed something that still bothers me. I got an email notification saying someone had tried to log into one of my old accounts. The login attempt was from the same town his house was in. I changed everything after that. I don't know what his real intentions were, and honestly, I don't want to know. Nothing technically happened to me, but I really believe if I stayed longer, something eventually would have. If you ever see deals like that offering free housing from strangers online, just remember, nothing like that is ever really free. I hired her sometime around the beginning of last fall. I work long hours and live alone in a 2-floor house I bought a couple years ago. It's pretty small and yet still more space than I really need, and I started realizing I was falling behind on keeping it clean. Maybe I needed a girlfriend to keep the place clean at the time. No matter how much I told myself I'd get to cleaning the house, I never seemed to be able to. One night after work, I was just scrolling Craigslist and other similar sites and saw a listing for house cleaning. It was just a simple post saying independent cleaner, cash only, flexible schedule. I figured why not, maybe this was what I needed. I emailed and she responded the next morning. She said she usually did apartments but was fine doing houses too. We agreed on a day she could come by while I was at work. She asked a few normal questions like how big the house was and if there were pets. I told her no pets, relatively small house, and that I lived alone. Looking back, I wish I hadn't mentioned that last part so casually. She came the following Thursday. I met her quickly before leaving for work, and yes, before you ask, I hid anything of value in my lockable closet before leaving. She looked to be maybe 38. She seemed very quiet. She didn't really make eye contact much, but I just figured she was shy. I showed her around quickly, all the rooms I wanted her to clean upstairs and downstairs. I told her she didn't need to worry about my office room. She asked where I usually keep the cleaning supplies, and I showed her the laundry room. She asked if she could come regularly every couple weeks. I said maybe. I wanted to see how this first time went. Before I left, she asked what time I usually got home from work. I told her around 6 or sometimes closer to 7, depending on traffic. At the time, that didn't seem weird since she probably just didn't want to still be there. When I got home that night, the place honestly looked great. The floors and counters were shiny, and everything smelled like cleaning products. I paid her what we agreed, and she left. Nothing seemed wrong. For about a week, everything was good. Then it started. Maybe 6 nights later, I woke up around 2 or 3 in the morning. I'm not a great sleeper, so this wasn't unusual. What was unusual was I thought I heard a soft thump from downstairs. It sounded like maybe something settling or one of those random house noises you hear at night. Put simply, I ignored it, as most people do when they hear these sounds. A couple nights later, I woke up again, and this time, I heard what sounded like a cabinet door closing. Again, I just assumed I was half asleep and imagining things. I didn't go check. I definitely wasn't going to go walk around a dark house at 3 in the morning over something that was probably nothing. I wish I did. Over the next week, I started noticing small things that felt slightly off, but not enough to really alarm me. One morning, a kitchen cabinet was open a few inches. I figured maybe I left it that way. Another time, a chair at my dining room table seemed pulled out slightly. Again, I assumed I must have done it without thinking. One Saturday morning, I noticed the downstairs bathroom hand towel felt damp. Stuff like that kept happening. Small things that you could always explain away if you want to. Then the nighttime sounds kept happening. Always soft enough to explain away.
Once it sounded like a single slow footstep, but I convinced myself it was probably the wood floors adjusting. I started sleeping with my bedroom door shut instead of cracked open like I usually did. I didn't really want to admit I was getting uneasy, but I was. One night I woke up and was almost sure I heard movement right outside my bedroom, like pressure being shifted in the floor. I still didn't get up. I just stared at my door, waiting to see if the handle would move. Yes, I was starting to get that paranoid. But nothing happened, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning, I felt stupid for even being scared. I checked the house, and everything looked normal. Around this time, I texted the cleaner again about coming back since overall she did a good job, and I figured maybe I was just stressed from work. She came again another weekday while I was at work. It was the same routine. I left the back door unlocked for her. When I got home, everything looked clean again. She asked if I wanted to schedule something regular. I told her maybe once a month. Anything more than that seemed like a waste of money to me. About a week after that second cleaning, I started noticing food seemed to be disappearing slightly faster than it should. Like I lost my mind one night swearing to myself that there was at least one more yogurt cup in the fridge the previous night, and now it was gone. Bread slices seemed lower than I remembered too. I still was trying to explain these things away though. But one morning, I found a glass in the sink that I was almost positive I hadn't used. I lived alone and was single at the time, so there really wasn't anyone else it could have been. At one point, I wondered if maybe I was doing these things half asleep and not remembering. I even Googled stuff about sleepwalking. Things really changed one night when I woke up and clearly heard slow footsteps downstairs. I know what footsteps sound like compared to house settling noises. These were steps. I grabbed my phone and stopped to listen for a sec. After maybe 10 seconds, I heard what sounded like something lightly bump into a wall. I didn't go downstairs. I know some people might think that sounds stupid, but fear really does make you freeze sometimes instead of act. Or maybe I was picking flight over fight before even confronting the situation. I just stayed in bed, sitting up for half an hour, not hearing anything again, and finally convincing myself it was nothing. And looking back, I look at myself as a coward for that. Morning came, and that day I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. I even checked my basement, even though I never heard anything from there. Clear. A few days later, I noticed something that really bothered me. In my kitchen junk drawer, where I keep random things like batteries and takeout menus, I also kept 2 spare house keys on a small ring. One of them was gone. I got goosebumps when I considered the obvious possibility, but I kept telling myself no, it's not possible. I searched the whole house, but I couldn't find it. The cleaner had been alone in the house twice for several hours each time. I started locking my bedroom door at night after that. About 4 nights later, I decided to test something. I left for work like normal, but after driving a few blocks, I circled back and parked on the next street over. I walked back quietly and went in through my back door. I stayed upstairs and just waited. Around 11 in the morning, I heard something. The sound of my front door unlocking. I heard very soft footsteps come inside. I moved to where I could see part of the downstairs through the stair railing. It looked like her, the cleaner. She just walked in like she lived here. She didn't even have cleaning supplies. She went into my kitchen, opened the fridge, took out a drink, and sat at my table. She sat there quietly for a few minutes. Then she walked slowly around my living room looking at things. She picked up a framed photo of me and my brother and just stared at it. Then she walked toward the stairs. I backed up as quietly as I could into my bedroom and shut the door without making any noise. I honestly didn't know what to do. I didn't want her to know I was home yet. After maybe a minute, I heard her walk halfway up the stairs and then stop. I could see her shadow under my door. She just stood there not moving, as if she knew I was at the door. It felt like at least a full minute. With my mind racing, I decided it was now or never to confront her. I flung the door open, and I was not expecting her to actually already be standing mere feet away from the door, already looking at it, and now looking at me. But I quickly realized, now that I had a closer look, it wasn't the same lady. It was another Hispanic lady, yes, but her build, hair, and face were all different. There was something so bone-chilling about her face. She had this blank, nearly angry, hateful look on her face. I didn't say anything, and neither did she. We just stood there for a few seconds before she slowly turned and walked back down the stairs like nothing happened. I heard my front door open and close a few seconds later. My heart was pounding and I was shaking. I think I was genuinely too nervous and shook to move or say a word. I waited maybe 5 minutes before even moving. Dialing 911 was almost difficult with how shaky my fingers were. The police came and I explained everything. I explained there were 2 different women. I gave them the phone number and email of the cleaning lady and any other info I could provide. The original cleaning lady stopped responding completely after that day. I replaced every lock in the house that same day. Like literally right after the cops left, I went straight to Ace Hardware. What still bothers me is the officer asking me if I had given anyone else a key, to which I told him no. He just said sometimes people like that don't work alone. I never hired another cleaner again. It's crazy to think that 2008 was almost 20 years ago, but here we are. For anybody who's too young to remember, the early 2000s were sort of like the Wild West for the internet in many ways. Back in 2008, I was in my early 20s, and honestly, I was a bit reckless. I was way too trusting, and I was the king of saying things like, "That could never happen to me." I just never really had that sense of urgency or anxiety that others had. That is, until one spring evening, when I experienced for myself firsthand that downright evil individuals really exist in the world. Facebook had just started to blow up, but most people I knew were still rocking MySpace. Social media was a thing, but not like today. We had all heard horror stories about the internet, but nobody I knew actually cared, or more accurately, we were all just incredibly ignorant. I bring all this up because perhaps the most insane thing about the internet at the time was a little website called Craigslist. Now, I know Craigslist is still around, but it's nothing compared to what it was back in the early 2000s. We didn't have websites like Marketplace, so if you wanted something, you went to Craigslist. We could find and purchase anything from small trinkets to vehicles and everything in between. You could even find work or odd jobs for some extra cash. I had heard from friends who used Craigslist all the time that it was the greatest website ever. They swore by it. I never had any interest in visiting the website until my life started to unravel a bit in the spring of 2008. I was living with my girlfriend, and with almost no notice, she dumped me and threw me out of the house. Thankfully, I wasn't living on the street or anything like that because I had friends who would let me crash at their place. I spent the immediate days after the breakup trying to find my own apartment, but it was proving harder than I thought on my $7 an hour salary. One of my friends, whom I had previously mentioned, who swore by Craigslist, told me to check it out for possible houses or even rooms for rent. I may have been reckless and ignorant, but surprisingly, that was a hard pass for me. I don't know why, I just didn't love the idea for some reason. However, I did start looking for furniture and items to eventually fill my place whenever I had a place to fill, since she kept everything after the breakup. At first, it was like a treasure chest of goods. I could finally see why people loved Craigslist. I literally could find anything I needed. I was finding deals left and right. My buddy had a massive garage that he allowed me to store my recently purchased furniture in until I found my own place. One afternoon, I was looking for a love seat or a small couch to store in the garage. I found a post from a guy named Keith who was selling a whole sectional for $45. He had a picture with the posting, and it was a smaller sectional sofa that could fit in most living rooms. Not to mention, it looked like it was in great shape. The price seemed too good to be true, but as I said, I was ignorant, and I just saw a cool couch and a low price tag. I messaged Keith, and to my surprise, he messaged me back almost right away and told me the couch was still available. He seemed friendly and trustworthy. Well, as trustworthy as anyone can be over messaging on the internet. He told me that he had gotten a new job in another state and he was just trying to sell, hence the low price. The reason seemed good enough to me, so we exchanged numbers and set up a time to meet that evening. A meetup that would go on to traumatize me for years and open my eyes to the horror that exists even in our own backyards. I pulled up to the house around 9 p.m. that night, probably a red flag for most, but not for me at the time. He told me he had some other work arrangement, so he couldn't meet until that time. It didn't seem weird to me.
The house was dark, and not just because it was dark outside. Everything looked desolate. It was a very run-down street with almost no street lamps. There were several houses on the block, and they were all just as dark and decrepit as Keith's house. I tried calling Keith several times with the number he gave me, but I just kept getting one of those automated responses that the number is no longer in service. Just as I was about to drive away, my phone buzzed. It was a weird number with a different area code. I answered, and I was greeted with a friendly and somewhat unnerving voice. His voice was deep and almost erratic. He called me fella and started apologizing about the phone business. He told me that he broke his phone a little while ago and he was calling me on his work phone. I was definitely a little weirded out, but not scared or uneasy. I was honestly more annoyed than anything. I realize hindsight is 2020, but at the time, when you're in these kinds of situations, your brain is just kind of working differently. I wasn't thinking about the worst. I was thinking about that couch. He told me to meet him around the back side of the residence, and he would unlock the back door for me. I didn't even question it for 1 second. I made my way to the back and couldn't believe that it was still so dark. I figured this guy would turn on some kind of light for me. I got to the back door and just stood there for a moment. I didn't know if he just wanted me to walk inside or if he was coming outside to get me. I decided to call him again on what he said was his work cell. Instead of hearing the ring in my ear, I hear a generic ringtone coming from behind me. Not in the house, but from the bushes in the backyard. I hate to even say this, but this is the first time I finally felt some kind of feeling that something might not be right. Keith ran out from the bushes, waving his ringing flip phone, and with that strange voice, he told me that he was getting rid of some old food and he was just coming out to greet me. He said that he didn't mean to alarm me. He claimed that he liked to feed the squirrels and whatever other animals lived in those bushes. I told him it was fine and that I just wanted to see the couch so I could be on my way. In a cheerful voice, he said, "Of course." He skipped by me, almost stumbling as he passed me. We got to the back door, and it looked like he was struggling to open it. When he told me to meet him in the back, I just assumed that he was going to be opening it from the inside of the house. I didn't expect him to be trying to open the door from the outside. This was the first time I got a good look at Keith. At least as good a look as I could get in the limited light. He was older, but not old. I would say maybe late 50s. He was really skinny and had long white hair that was pulled back in a nasty ponytail. Worst of all, he smelled like a dirty ashtray full of cigarette butts. He pulled away from the door a little bit and asked if I could help him get the door open. He said sometimes the door would stick and he was embarrassed that he couldn't get it open. He told me to just use my shoulder and push the door as hard as I could. At this point, I knew something was wrong, but I was already in the moment and was just kind of going with the flow. I grabbed the doorknob and lowered my shoulder into the door. It didn't stick at all. In fact, as I lowered my shoulder to push it open, someone from the other side opened the door. I had so much momentum now that I lost my balance and fell to the floor. When I hit the ground, I heard Keith yell, "Now!" In the dark room, 2 other people emerged from each side and held me on the ground. I started to squirm, but it didn't matter. One of the guys holding me down was huge. Keith started to kick my face. One of the worst parts of all of this was the sheer darkness of the situation. I couldn't see anything, and that made everything feel so much worse. I could feel my body starting to get weak from Keith kicking me. He told the other guy to grab the tape, and I heard the sound of tape ripping. I couldn't even imagine what they planned on doing. What happened next is probably the closest thing to a miracle that has ever happened to me. During the struggle of me falling and being held down, I accidentally dialed my friend, the friend that I had been living with since the breakup. The sounds of him yelling hello were coming through the phone loud and clear. I decided to yell, "I'm in the back of the house, come and help me." Clearly a bluff. I was alone, but I wasn't sure if these guys knew that. I was hopefully trying to scare them into thinking I had someone else in the car with me. The big guy eased his grip and looked at Keith, who had stopped kicking for a brief second. That second was all I needed. I was able to free myself, and I ran out the door and back to my car. I could hear them chasing me, but I didn't look back. I shut the car door and locked it immediately before starting it. Just as I was peeling away, I saw the big guy clearly for the first time. He was bald and had one of those patchy beards. His eyes were the worst part. They were dark and looked lifeless. He was trying to open the door even as I was driving away. I just kept driving.
I drove for hours before I went back to my friend's house. I was scared that somehow those guys were going to follow me, and I didn't want them to know where I was staying. I called my friend back and told him everything. I eventually called the authorities, but it was too late. The post was gone, and apparently, the cell phone was some sort of track phone, and Keith ditched it. I gave them the best description I could, but as far as I know, Keith and those two other guys are still out there in the world. What scares me every time I think about that night is when I think about their intention. This wasn't just a robbery. He lured me in with a $45 deal. Whatever these monsters wanted, it wasn't just money. It was so much worse. I start going down a rabbit hole in my mind, thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't somehow escaped. As I wrote this story, I'm well aware of the stupid choices I made along the way. I'm just so thankful I'm here to tell it.
My college years were some of the best years of my life. Don't get me wrong, I'm very happy with the life I live, but my memories of those 4 years are eternal. My advice to anyone still in college, don't take it for granted, because it definitely flies by. I went to a beach college. Our campus was literally right on the water. This story takes place while I was undergoing pledge with my pledge class. If you don't know, that's basically a full semester of initiation for everyone who got bids to the frat that semester. Most of what happens during pledge is better left undiscussed. Anyway, it was the last week of pledge before we officially became brothers. Typically, this is the week where the fraternity kicks things up a notch, so to speak. For us, it was commonly understood that at some point during the final week, we'd have to undergo the beach challenge. Here's what would happen. The brothers would drive our entire class about 12 miles down the coast on Friday night. Then we'd have an hour to finish a massive keg filled with God knows what. Then they'd walk us down to the beach, tie all of our wrists together, blindfold us, take our phones, watches, and shoes, and leave us there. We'd have until sunrise to make it back to the house. Otherwise, we'd all be dropped. To be completely honest with you, I was pretty nervous leading up to this, but there was really nothing I could do. There was nothing any of us could do. I remember it being oddly chilly the night of, but the excitement of becoming a brother and finally being done with all this nonsense was adrenalizing. The kegs were the easy part. By this point, we were pretty comfortable with divvying up the alcohol and pulling trig if necessary. There were 15 of us. After tying us together, the brothers blindfolded everyone but Chandler, who was at the very front of the line. He was to be our eyes, but that's all the help we'd get. Our pledge master was this big Mexican guy named Ramirez, but he insisted we all call him Los Pollos, like the restaurant from Breaking Bad. He was a strange dude. He outlined the rules for us one last time, then joined the rest of the brothers and left. We were now on our own. I won't run you through everyone's names, but my closest friends in my pledge class were Chandler, Whitworth, Jackson, and Vikram. I was at the very back of the line, and Whitworth was directly in front of me. We began walking with Chandler leading us. It was hell. Without our phones, there really was no way of telling how much ground we were covering or how much time we had left. All we could do was keep walking. At first, we tried to liven the mood by talking and cracking jokes, but eventually that got old. After what I'll call 2 hours of walking, we were trudging along in complete silence, with the occasional stop for someone to throw up. I started to disassociate. Even the sounds of the ocean grew silent as I walked along, trapped inside my own head. It was completely silent. Suddenly, I felt a sharp tug on the rope around my wrists, so I took a few big steps forward and stopped, assuming Whitworth had fallen. Whitworth was a little more clumsy than most, so this kind of thing wasn't super surprising. I didn't really have the strength nor energy to ask him if he was alright, so I just waited. I must have been standing there like a statue for a full minute. Something felt off. I was just about to say something, when the rope around my wrists was pulled tight again. I resumed walking, pleased that Whitworth hadn't passed out. The trek resumed, and I drifted back into my zoned out phase, feeling terrible. I prayed we were closing in on the final stretch. We had to be. Just then, I took what must have been my 10,000th step, but something was different. Instead of hitting damp sand, my foot slapped the unmistakable thin layer of ocean water. I took a few more steps and the water got deeper. reaching up to my ankles. I was confused. Why would Chandler be leading us into the water? The rope pulled tight again, meaning Whitworth and everyone else in front of me was continuing to walk, so I did the same. I guess I figured someone needed to wash off their feet for whatever reason. If no one else was complaining though, I definitely wasn't going to start. The water remained ankle height for a while, advancing and receding with the sway of the waves. Just then though, I felt the water begin to rise again, until it was comfortably around my shins. Chandler was definitely screwing with us, which for the life of me I couldn't understand why. Wasn't this stupid activity painful enough? The water was only going to slow us down. Seconds later, it began to pick up on a faint sound in the distance. I craned my ears and began to recognize it. It was the sound of an idling boat engine. As we continued to walk, the drone of the engine only got louder, meaning it was getting closer, or I was getting closer to it. I was starting to get really uncomfortable. The water was almost up to my knees at this point. Finally, I broke what must have been hours of unspoken silence. Guys, what the hell are we doing in the water? I waited, confused as to why no one was answering me. Guys, I asked again in a more concerned voice. Still nothing. I could feel panic begin to set in. Suddenly, my blindness was suffocating. I had to look around. I reached my wrists up towards my eyes in an attempt to undo my blindfold. As I did so, the rope yanked away from me, forcing my arms back down. I cursed, plunging my head down towards my fingers and undoing my blindfold before the rope could be jolted away from me again. To my horror, Whitworth wasn't the one guiding me. Instead, I found myself staring at a random, middle-aged man holding the frayed end of the rope tied around my wrists. I stared in shock at the severed rope in his hand, and that's when I realized what had done the cutting. A long, rusty kitchen knife sat in his left hand. Past him, there was a boat bobbing in the water, and I could make out 3 more silhouettes towering on board. I screamed bloody murder before he had a chance to react, yanking my arms upward as fiercely as I could. At the same time, I lifted a foot out of the water and kicked his chest with all the strength I could muster. Luckily, the rope broke free from his grip. He grabbed my shirt to try and cushion his fall, but the fabric gave way with a deafening rip. He yelled as he plunged into the water with a huge chunk of my white pledge t-shirt, but I was already moving as fast as I could toward dry land, my wrists still tied. A few seconds passed before I heard a splash from further away. Someone had jumped off the boat. I didn't even look behind me, I just kept moving. I was about halfway to the sand when something whizzed right past my head, maybe a few inches from my right ear. It was the knife. I watched it shoot past me before disappearing into the water. I was in complete shock, but the adrenaline was doing its job. I got to land and for the first time looked back. There were 2 men in the water and 2 on the boat. They weren't chasing me anymore, just staring lifelessly in my direction. The closest man was still holding onto the white piece of my shirt that had torn off in the fray. I didn't waste another second. I ran up the beach and made it to the street. By this point, it was past sunrise, but my frat was the last thing I was thinking about. I flagged down the nearest car, and after pleading to use their phone, called the police. It was no use. By the time the cops showed up, the 4 men were gone, presumably off to wherever in that tiny little boat of theirs. I lied to the cops about what happened, worried that there might be repercussions for the frat. Luckily, they didn't ask questions. I didn't get too much crap from my frat brothers. They were actually more pissed at Chandler for not realizing what had happened, even though he swears he didn't hear a thing. After that, I became a brother, and things went back to normal. Well, normal for a while. A few weeks later, a couple of the guys and I were playing beach die in the sand behind the house when Jackson noticed something in the distance. There was a stick poking out of the sand, and tied to that stick was the white piece of cloth that had been torn from my t-shirt. The design on the ripped stick was unmistakable. It was my shirt. To this day, I have no idea how they knew which frat I was in. My brothers think they might have recognized the piece of my t-shirt, but I have a more sinister theory. I think it's very possible that they knew our frat would be sending us pledges on that beach that night, helpless and blind. I think they very well could have planned the whole thing around that stupid tradition, swooping in and kidnapping whoever they could. I was just unlucky enough to be in the back, which still gives me chills to this day. I still wonder what might have happened to me had I gotten on that boat. The police, as always, were useless. It's been nearly a number of years, and they never found anything. This happened to me about a year ago today, which is why I'm writing about it now. I'm a 19-year-old college student that was in the middle of joining a fraternity on my campus. I go to a big party school down south, and Greek life is taken very seriously there. For privacy reasons, I'll spare the specific details, but this particular night was my initiation, meaning the night that me and my class of 20 students would officially become brothers of the fraternity. During the process of joining, which lasts a couple of months, the brothers would make us do odd things, like blindfold us and take us to strange places. You know, typical hazing stuff. This was one of those nights. We were blindfolded and left the frat house around 10:30 p.m. The brothers took our phones and drove us to a mystery location, split between a couple different cars to make sure we all got there. On the way over, they made us try and memorize some corny song while it blasted on full volume. We always had to do these annoying tasks while blindfolded, I guess as part of the whole hazing thing. Anyway, after about 20 minutes of driving, the car stopped and I heard the doors open and close. I felt a hand grab my arm and silently usher me out of the car. We walked probably 200 feet, where I was then told to sit down and be quiet. I was sitting on grass, so I assumed we were in a field or something. I could also tell I was sitting near people because I heard them sit down, and I also heard the brothers telling each of them to be quiet. After about a minute of sitting in silence, I heard a voice speak to all of us, saying a bunch of fraternity-related things, but mostly about how we were deemed worthy of becoming a part of the brotherhood. Then, over the course of like 30 minutes, I sat in silence, occasionally hearing the sound of footsteps and movement around me. I figured they might have been doing the final steps of initiation with each person individually, like walking them away to talk to them in private. I didn't know for sure, but being blindfolded meant I was just left to my imagination. There was a time, though, when the footsteps went away, and all I was left with were the sounds of crickets and leaves rustling through the night breeze. I began to grow uncomfortable, as it must have been like 20 minutes that I was sitting there in silence. Then suddenly, I finally heard the footsteps of one of the brothers walk up to me, and I felt a hand grab my wrist and lead me away. He didn't say a word, and neither did I. I just wanted to get it over with so I could take this stupid blindfold off. While we walked, I could feel the ground below me go from grass to more rough terrain. I could tell we were walking through a forest, as I felt branches and shrubs scrape against my body. We were walking for some time, and at one point, the blindfold became very uncomfortable around my eyes. I told him this and asked if we could stop for a second so I could adjust it. He stopped and let go of me. As I stood there rubbing my eyes from under the blindfold, I heard a deep, raspy voice say, "Take it off." I hesitated for a second, not knowing what to say. His voice threw me off as it didn't sound like a voice I recognized. Needless to say, I took it off, and what I was greeted with was not what I imagined. I was standing face to face with some tall guy dressed in all black wearing a vendetta mask. I let out a sharp yell and jumped back. A part of me thought this was just some fucked up hazing prank, but before a word could even escape my mouth, he lunged at me, yelling that he was going to take me with him. We wrestled on the ground, and I could tell that he was trying to choke me out. With all my strength, I threw him off of me, got up, and bolted in the opposite direction, using nothing but moonlight to guide my way back. My heart was beating 1,000,000 times a minute, and I kept looking back, fearing that he was following me. I eventually heard people yelling my name, and I nearly ran head-on into one of the fraternity brothers. I told him in scrambled, broken words that some random guy wearing a mask led me into the forest and tried fighting me, but before I could warn them any further, 5 or 6 of them rushed past me with flashlights looking to chase after him. One of them stayed with me to calm me down and walk me back to safety. When we made it out of the woods, I realized we were in a backyard, presumably one of the brothers' houses. I saw nearly the whole fraternity standing out on the porch, looking at us in shock. I asked them what the hell was going on. They said that since it was dark and that I was the last in line, the brother who was supposed to be escorting me somehow overlooked that I was there and completely forgot about me. They said a couple minutes later, one of them thought they saw movement in the woods, which was around the same time that they realized I wasn't in my group. I was in such shock I couldn't even be pissed about it. None of them knew who that man was, but some of the brothers speculated it could have been a brother from another fraternity. Shortly after, flashlights emerged from the trees, and I saw them running back towards us. They told everyone to get the fuck out of there and get back to the campus immediately. He didn't ask questions. They locked up the house, and one of them got on the phone with the police. The whole car ride back, I was bombarded with questions, and I answered them the best I could with my mind still racing. I wondered where that man came from, why was he wearing a mask, and what he could have been leading me to. I made up scenarios in my head, like how it could have been a brother from a rival fraternity trying to steal me before I was initiated. That doesn't explain why the brothers locked up the house and called the police, though. I didn't find out until the next day, when one of the brothers who ran after him told me what they found in those woods, and what they found was not what I expected. As they were running, they saw a light in the distance. They grew silent, and when they got closer, they realized it was a bonfire in the middle of a clearing. Standing around the fire were several people dressed in all black and wearing white vendetta masks, chanting and throwing things into the fire. One of the brothers stepped on a loud branch, causing all of the masked men to turn and face them. They froze up, and like something straight out of a horror movie, the mysterious men suddenly started running in their direction. They fled and made it back, where they told everyone else to leave and call the police. It seemed as though we somehow walked ourselves into some cult ritual meeting of some sort. I couldn't sleep for many nights after, and I tried my best to rid my mind of the situation. However, something that I heard from the fraternity a few days later sent shivers down my spine. While a few of them were playing football in the backyard of that same house, they found a white vendetta mask hanging from a tree nearby. They called the police, and the cops took it for evidence and examination. I'm not sure if those guys were ever caught or if the police even made anything of it. I'm also not sure what the hell those weird people were doing in those woods. I've been thinking about this experience a lot recently, and I'm glad that I was left with nothing more than a crazy story. It's been 8 years since I graduated from college. I went to Cooper Union, a small technical school smack dab in the middle of Manhattan. Going to school in New York City was amazing, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. We didn't have many frats back then, so I was sure to join whichever one I could just to ensure that I'd have parties to go to and whatnot. I was a relatively normal kid, so it wasn't too difficult to get a bid. Most of the pledge events were pretty tame, but I would soon find out what they were compensating for. I hope I don't get in trouble for divulging this story, but it happened so long ago that I figure it's safe to talk about. I doubt my old frat is still making their pledges even do this. I certainly hope they aren't. Anyway, the big thing that we'd do during our initiation was a subway crawl. I can't remember where exactly this was, but there was an old abandoned subway station that teenagers would typically explore. Our frat would make us enter from one of the active platforms, walk to the abandoned one, take some pictures, and then continue to the next active platform. We'd been given subway schedules to ensure that there was no chance a train would come around while we were vulnerable. We'd have plenty of time to get onto the abandoned platform, wait for one train to pass, and then make it to the next station. I know what you're probably thinking, but no, we didn't have to run from a train. The route was planned pretty well, and we all had a lot of leeway when it came to traversing the track. All we had to do was avoid the dangerous third rail and we'd be okay. I had been a big fan of urban exploring before college, so this was honestly more exciting than nerve-wracking for me. It was some random weekday at like 3 a.m. when our frat brothers made us go down into the subway. I'm pretty sure they picked this time because trains were very infrequent and we'd be protected at all costs. There were about 10 of us. I'm telling you, it was a pretty small school. You don't need to know everyone's name, but I should mention that my closest friend in my pledge class was an Albanian dude named Riker. He's the funniest guy you'll ever meet. My friends and I always said he should try and do stand-up comedy. He also smoked a crap ton of pot, which is important for this story. The group of us made our way into the subway unscathed. Riker and I brought up the rear because everyone else was too scared to do so. It was really dark in there, and our frat brothers had only given us 2 flashlights to share. Those flashlights and a single cheap film camera were all we had. At first, I was entrusted with one of the flashlights for being in the back, but I quickly gave it up to one of my pledge brothers who was whining about not being able to see. Not even 30 seconds into the walk, and Riker had his first genius idea. He pulled out a pre-rolled joint from his jacket and grinned, motioning for me to stop. "I don't have enough to share," he whispered, flicking his head in the direction of the other guys who hadn't noticed what we were doing. Against my better judgment, I obliged, Heck, when was I going to get the chance to light up in a subway tunnel again? The two of us smoked while we watched the other guys travel further away from us, their echoing laughter beginning to fade out. We finished the pot, and we were a considerable distance behind the pack. Riker's stuff was really strong, and I found myself a little more absent-minded than I wanted to be. My tolerance was definitely not as high as his. The two of us picked up the pace to catch up with the rest of the group, but Riker noticed something in our way. We didn't have a light, so all we could see was the silhouette of someone in the dimly lit tunnel lights. I strained my eyes a little more. There was definitely a person in there, just standing motionless in the middle of the track, facing us. It was honestly a little creepy. "David?" called Riker, his voice piercing the silence of the tunnel. The person on the track didn't respond. Just then, David's voice called back to us from further up the line. The two of us froze. This person in front of us was a stranger. As if David's voice was some kind of switch, the person on the track started full-on sprinting towards us. The two of us turned around and bolted back the way we came. Being as high as I was, I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. The figure's sprint was eerily silent, as if we were being chased by a shadow. The sky must have been impossibly light. Riker's grip on my arm tightened, his goofy confidence completely gone. "Faster," he hissed, the fear in his voice mimicking my own. I knew we still had some time before the next train came, but running in the wrong direction just felt wrong. Riker must have thought the same thing, because he frantically pulled me to the side, motioning for us to cross the divider onto a different track. In hindsight, we probably could have continued running back to the original station, but I was so high that I just followed Riker blindly. We made it across the divider and sprinted back in the direction of the abandoned station. Things were even more terrifying now, though. We had literally no idea when a train was going to barrel down towards us on this track, but at least we were heading in the right direction. I hoped Riker's maneuver was enough to shake whoever was chasing us, but apparently it wasn't. Whoever was behind us also crossed the divider and kept running after us. The problem was there were only a few places where the divider could be crossed, so we'd have to pray we found another one before a train came. Turning around to the one we just used was no longer an option. My heart was thumping, but Riker and I were able to widen the gap between us and our pursuer. We kept running though, looking for a place to cross, but with no luck. Riker started cursing repeatedly, and I started feeling like throwing up. We kept running, still searching for a place to cross. Just then, the track started vibrating, and we could see light beginning to poke through at the distant end of the tunnel. A train was coming. We were screwed. I considered turning around and just fighting whoever was behind us, but then Riker screamed right here, running toward the divider. By some miracle, the next crossing point was right in front of us, and the two of us crossed back to the original track. We sprinted like another 30 yards and caught up with the rest of the guys who were on the platform. Riker explained the whole thing while I leaned over and threw up. Not even 30 seconds later, the train on the other track zoomed by. Riker and the rest of the guys were ready to confront whoever was chasing us. No one showed up though. We thought the worst, but just then, we heard another crazed yell from somewhere in the distance. To this day, I still have no idea how that person avoided the train. We waited for the train to pass on our track and then sprinted the hell out of there. In hindsight, Riker and I probably just encountered some homeless guy who was drugged out and might not have even posed a threat to us. The fear took over in that moment though, which I guess explains the stupid decision we made to cross over the divider. I'm sure the two of us also could have fended that guy off, but I'm glad we didn't have to. I experienced a sketchy situation on Halloween a couple years ago. My cousin came over for Halloween that year just to go trick-or-treating. I was 15 at the time, and I know that's a bit old for trick-or-treating, but hey, it's free candy. My cousin was also 15, and we were planning on taking it easy that Halloween and just hitting enough houses to make a reasonable haul before we went home. My friend and his younger brother went with us, but we eventually went our separate ways. It was pretty busy, and there was a whole lot of kids at every house with decorations up. My cousin Jack and I decided to hit some of the houses with lights on with no kids already on the front stoops. Lots of houses that we had already hit before that had no decorations up and had lights on all had people inside ready to deliver candy to trick-or-treaters. But all the other kids I know for a fact target the heavily decorated houses. We ended up getting through like 4 houses in a minute because of no lineups. The next house in the line was not decorated at all, but there was a light on, so we thought we'd give it a shot. We knocked on the door and immediately an older man opened the door. He opened it completely, which revealed 5 other guys just standing there. They were much younger than the older man who opened the door. I'm guessing they were in their late 30s, while the older man who opened the door was in his early 50s. He held out a bowl of candy, then reached in and grabbed some and put it in each of our bags. The older man asked Jack what his name was, and Jack responded to his question using a fake name. Jack said bye before the older man could say anything else. We walked off the front stoop, and alarms immediately started going off in my head. Jack seemed alarmed as well, and we started talking about how sketchy that was. Why were there 6 guys right there when we opened the door? Why were they all acting so strange? Those were the questions that were floating around in my head. Jack and I were a little spooked because of how weird that was. We went to 2 more houses, then we started walking to my house. Jack and I glanced back at that house to see a car pulling out of the driveway. The car drove up the way we were walking and started slowing down right next to us. The roads were clear, and all the trick-or-treaters were on the sidewalks, so there should have been no reason the car slowed down right next to us. We picked up the pace a bit, and that's when another car sped up behind them, eventually beginning to go the same pace as the first car. I recognized the guy driving the first car, and the guy driving the second car. The guy driving the first car was the older guy who gave us the candy, and the driver in the second car was one of the 5 guys just standing there suspiciously. There was also somebody in the passenger seat in the first car, but all I could see was the silhouette of the person. When Jack and I were 2 houses away from my house, we saw the first car park right across the street from my house. We didn't even see where the second car went, we just bolted back inside my house. Our parents, who were sitting in the living room talking, asked us what was wrong. We told them the whole story, and when we were finished, we went to the window to check if that car was still parked across the street, and it was. But then 5 seconds after I checked, it drove off. It had probably been parked there for the 5 minutes since we went inside my house. My mom and Jack's mom wanted Jack and I to go show our dads the house where all those guys were in. But eventually, our parents calmed us down and told us it was just a Halloween gag or something. Though I have my own theory on what was going on. The reason why there were 6 guys in the main doorway was because when a lone trick-or-treater or group of trick-or-treaters much younger than Jack and I came to the door, they were looking to jump or snatch them. But when they saw that Jack and I were teenagers and literally the same height as them, they decided to play it cool, even though they still looked sketchy. And why they were following us in their cars, we will never know. But when the night ended and everyone was off to bed, I realized that house is only 1 block from my house. This was many years ago. My old buddy Anthony and I were getting on our costumes to go trick-or-treating. We started going house to house just like a normal night. We got to the old part of our neighborhood, where our parents would tell us not to go because we were only 12 years old and we didn't know our way around there. We walked up to the first house there, and a nice lady opened the door who gave us big Hershey bars. After that, while we were walking to literally only the second house in this part of the neighborhood, this random guy came screaming and running towards us down the street. He came out from behind a church. We thought it was just a Halloween prank at first, like anyone would, so we stood there just laughing. But as soon as he got up to us, he tried taking the pillowcase full of candy out of my hands, so my buddy Anthony started hitting him with his pillowcase. By the time we got to this old neighborhood, we had a lot of candy, so being hit with that pillowcase surely had to hurt. Anthony was hitting him until he let go of the pillowcase and started running away. We thought that was the end of him, until we started walking back, extremely shocked and confused. I called my mom and asked her if she could pick us up because we were pretty far from home, and that whole experience kind of made us want to get off the streets. As soon as she got to our location, we explained what happened, and she almost didn't believe us. That's how ridiculous it sounded. We got home around 10 p.m., and shortly after that, there was a knock at the front door. My dad figured it was just a late-night trick-or-treater, so we went to answer the door, and standing there was a man in a jumpsuit with a Michael Myers mask. My dad was confused because he was wondering what he was doing out alone trick-or-treating,
and based on his height and build, he looked like an older man, not a kid or a teenager. Either way, my dad just gave him candy and didn't really care to say anything. But while Anthony and I were sitting on the couch, we noticed him staring at us, like his masked face was staring right at us in the living room. I felt slightly unsettled by it and was waiting for him to just turn and leave. My dad ended up shutting the door in his face when he wouldn't walk away. So fast forward to like 1 in the morning. We were about to go to bed, but on our way upstairs, we heard a knock at the door. There was no way I was opening the door at that hour, and I knew this couldn't be anything good this late. So I went to tell my dad there was a knock at the door, and he said just ignore it. So Anthony and I go up to the room and turn on a movie. Anthony heard something though, and told me to mute the TV, and when I did, I heard it too. It was the sound of leaves crackling in the backyard. I looked in the backyard, and I saw that man in the Michael Myers costume, swinging on the swing set in our yard, staring into my bedroom window. I felt like my heart jumped out of my chest and up into my throat. It's like he was purposely recreating a scene from a horror movie to scare us. I ran into my dad's room and told him that the man in the Michael Myers costume was on our swing set. He took on this expression of shock and concern just like ours, and he looked outside, but he didn't see anyone there. Then, right when we were looking, we heard a knock at the back door. My dad went downstairs to the door, but nobody was there. This man was toying with us, harassing us to scare us. It had to be a Halloween prank. My dad was equally concerned now. All of a sudden, I heard my mom scream in the other room. So Anthony, my dad, and I ran upstairs to see the man in the Michael Myers costume standing at the end of the bed staring at my mom. My dad told Anthony and I to run and call the police. My friend and I ran downstairs and grabbed the nearest phone. We called 911 and told them that a man dressed as Michael Myers had broken into our house. The operator asked if everyone was all right. I said he's upstairs, and my dad has him, but we needed cops immediately. She told me to stay on the phone and that police were en route to the house. From upstairs, there was the sound of my dad screaming, followed by their sliding window being pushed open. The two of us ran upstairs to see my mom and dad laying on the floor. My mom was crying, and my dad's nose was bleeding. My dad said the man jumped out through the window. When the police arrived, Anthony, my dad, and I told them everything we could. They did a sweep of the property inside and out, which took about 20 minutes, and the premises was clear. I think that might have been my last year trick-or-treating, and for good reason. I still wonder if the man that tried to take my candy was the man wearing the Michael Myers costume, and I deeply regret leaving that part out of the story we gave to the police. Halloween was always one of my least favorite days of the year. I never had a lot of friends in middle school or high school, so I never really had any plans on Halloween. In middle school, I didn't really go trick-or-treating, and in high school, I never really went to any Halloween parties. This was also at a time when my sister was away at college, so due to the fact that my parents were hardly ever home, I'd usually be home alone. This was one of many Halloween nights that I was left home alone. Halloween was on a Friday this particular year, so kids were out in droves and later than usual. My parents were gone for the week. My mom left a bunch of bags of candy for me to hand to kids. I got kind of sick of the doorbell ringing every 5 minutes all day, so eventually I just poured an entire bag of candies into a plastic bowl we had in one of the kitchen cabinets. My mom never really liked leaving a bowl on the stoop, but she wasn't there, so what was she gonna do? That lasted a good while because the constant ringing of the doorbell stopped for a couple hours at least, and when the bowl was empty, I refilled it. I wasn't expecting to hear the doorbell again the rest of the night because even if the bowl were emptied, I assumed people would know not to bother ringing the bell at a house with an empty bowl. So when the bell did ring again, I was not only surprised, but also felt a hint of annoyance. I ignored the first ring, but about 30 seconds later, there was another ring. This time I got up from my computer, pausing the game I was playing, and went down to check who was at the front door. I opened the door, and there were two guys in white vendetta masks holding small plastic bags with very minimal candy inside, it seemed. Neither of the two of them said trick or treat. They just ominously both stood there, and then lifted up their bags and held them open. I said, "Hang on, I'll get more candy." I felt intimidated, if I'm being honest. I went to get the bag of Reese's and grabbed a few to put in their bags.
When I dropped the candies in their plastic bags, one of them, I don't know which, asked in a monotone voice, "Are you home alone?" I said no, but with a stutter because the question scared me. I said my parents are here. Then I said have a good night and shut the door. I waited by the door listening to see if I'd hear them walk down the steps. I finally heard footsteps leaving, so I felt relieved and started going back upstairs. But that question, am I home alone, kept haunting me. I couldn't just go back to my game after hearing that. And then I realized the possibility as to why they would have asked me that, because there were no cars at all in the driveway or in front of the house, yet the lights were on. Then when I, an at the time 14-year-old kid, opened the door, I probably looked like the easiest target ever. My paranoia was clearly justified though, because while sitting at my desk trying to get back into my game, I heard this loud bang from my window. I was on the second floor, so clearly something was just thrown at the window. My heart started to pound the inside of my chest again. In response, I turned off the computer screen and desk lamp to bring darkness into the room. I then looked out the window, and though I couldn't see anything out there because it was too dark, another object was thrown at the window right in front of me, this one scaring me even more than the last. It sounded like a rock. I instantly felt this intensifying sense of danger. I ducked back down behind the window and left my bedroom. I didn't have a cell phone at the time, only an iPod Touch, so I had to get to the kitchen house phone. I crawled my way down the stairs so not to be seen through any of the windows. I got to the kitchen phone and dialed 911, but I think they saw even just the light from the little screen of the phone, because there was suddenly an aggressive banging on one of the kitchen windows. By now I was on the phone with 911 begging for help. As I crouch walked out of the kitchen and towards the back door, I screamed, realizing there was one of the guys in the vendetta masks on the other side of the back door, trying to open it. I started screaming into the phone for help, but around the same time, a familiar voice was calling from the other side of the front door. It was our next door neighbor, Chris. I rushed to answer the door and he came in, clearly happy to see I was okay. He took the phone from me and spoke to the police for me. He saw the two masked men enter my backyard from his kitchen window and saw them throwing multiple things at the windows of the house. By the time any police officers arrived at the house, those two masked men clearly knew better than to have stuck around. Chris invited me to sleep at his place for the night just to be safe. He was good friends with my dad before he moved, so he really didn't mind helping me. Having good relations with your neighbors may just save your life one day, you never know. What I do know is this experience made me hate Halloween just that much more. Back in college, my junior year, we lived in a suite on campus. There were 4 dorm rooms in this suite. It was half of my friend group in the suite, and we all shared a common room and a small kitchenette. Our friend Cody, who was originally in the suite with us, ended up moving off campus to an apartment with his friend, so the school automatically assigned us a replacement, unfortunately. It was this kid named Rodney. He seemed normal enough. He had blonde short hair, a patchy light beard, almost non-existent eyebrows, and he was really tall. Medium build, but like 6'4". He was in the far corner of the suite, next to my room. We each had our own room, so there was 4 of us in the suite. Rodney seemed to keep to himself the first few days, until one day, I came back from class and he was sitting in the living room. He said he had to tell me something, and then told me he has parasomnia, which was the reason he was transferred from his previous dorm. I didn't know what that was, until he explained that it's a sleep disorder that may cause him to talk or yell in his sleep due to night terrors, and he just wanted everyone in the suite to be aware of it so that we wouldn't feel uncomfortable. But to tell you the truth, that being the first real conversation I had with the guy made me more uncomfortable than anything. I was hoping I'd get to know him on a more personal level, not find out he has a sleeping disorder. I also didn't entirely get why he thought it was necessary to tell me that. I texted in the dorm group chat we made with Cody still in it if Rodney had told them as well about his sleeping disorder yet. They all said no, and followed that with laughter and confusion. When my other 2 suite mates got back later, we hung out in the common room and discussed why we thought Rodney's sleep disorder could have been the reason for him to be transferred from his previous dorm. Then Rodney walked in and right past us after giving us a slight sup. He went to his room and shut the door. We had the TV on loud, so we whispered amongst ourselves about him. That night, I heard a knock at my door in the middle of the night. I asked who it was, to no reply. I ignored it, and I thought to myself, what if it was Rodney? The next day, I asked my friends if either of them knocked on my door last night, and they both texted me saying no. Cody was having a great laugh from all of this. I was already freaked out and was hoping this wouldn't be a regular thing because it was disturbing already. A few nights later, it got worse. It was the middle of the night. I had already woken up, checked my phone, and saw 2 a.m. I heard footsteps outside in the little hallway of the common area, and again, a knock at my door. I didn't answer this time. I knew it was Rodney, and he was starting to freak me out. He clearly was a heavy sleepwalker. I texted the group chat again right then and there at 2 a.m., telling them it just happened again. They didn't respond until morning time, saying they didn't hear anything. It must have been because Rodney's room was right next to mine. That day, I knocked on Rodney's door and asked him if it had been him knocking on my door in the middle of the night. He told me he had no recollection of doing so, but then apologized because he didn't mention that part of his parasomnia is sleepwalking. He told me it was completely harmless and to not worry, but I didn't exactly view it as completely harmless if it was waking me up in the middle of the night, freaking me out. A certain amount of time passed that I can't remember, probably less than 4 days. There hadn't been any other random middle of the night knocks on the door, which I was happy about. But this story wouldn't be told if something else didn't happen. I woke up to noise in my room. I looked around the dark room and spotted Rodney, in the corner of the room facing the wall, muttering to himself. I said Rodney's name, and he turned in my direction and kept saying, "Open the door, open the door." I was genuinely disturbed. He looked in my direction, but it didn't seem like he was looking at me, rather through me. I saw a smile on his face, and I heard what seemed to be a small laugh as he walked out of the room and out of my view. I didn't know if I was supposed to wake him up or not. I know nothing about sleepwalking and sleep disorders. There was silence now. I grabbed my phone and was about to text my friends, but I was interrupted by this deafeningly loud banging on a door outside, accompanied with Rodney's voice screaming, "Open the door." He was screaming it like a maniacal madman. I ran to the common area and saw him at the opposite end of the hall thrashing his fists on one of our suite mates' doors. I ran to Rodney and started shaking him to wake up. My two friends came out of their rooms to the commotion as well, and we all started to shake Rodney until he stopped, looked at all three of us, and with this blank look on his face, said, "I'm sorry guys," and walked to his room and shut the door. The three of us stood there in shock, not even knowing what to say or do. A neighboring room must have called campus police because they showed up at our door. We had to tell them the truth. Rodney spoke with them for a while, then he went back to his room. I made sure not to leave my room unlocked again that night. The next day, Rodney was gone, without a trace of him ever having been there. Like I said, I know nothing about sleepwalking or any of that stuff, but that didn't look like sleepwalking to me. I don't know what was or is currently going on in that guy's head, but he needs to get help. I got along fine with my college roommate Stacy. She was a messy one sometimes, but other than that we had no problems. We'd lend each other stuff all the time. At our school we had bunk beds, which I think are kind of unusual in college dorms. I was on the top bunk because I was the lighter sleeper, and Stacy was always constantly getting up in the middle of the night, so she'd definitely be waking me up if I were on the bottom. There was this one night that still sticks with me to this day, only because I don't really know how to logically explain it. Stacy and I were in our room studying. I was at my desk and she was in her bed. I had a big presentation the next day for one of my classes, so I was just going over my talking points again. In fact, I practiced them to Stacy a few times, and she acted as my audience, then asking questions afterwards. She told me I could borrow one of her tops tomorrow if I need to for my presentation, as I didn't have any nice formal kinds of tops with me at school. After helping me review, she went back to her studying for a little more, then she went to sleep. I wasn't done studying, but as a courtesy, I turned off my desk lamp and went up to my bunk and kept studying there on my laptop. Stacy would snore sometimes, so when she started snoring, I knew she was asleep. I continued my studying and rehearsing for another half hour to an hour before closing my laptop screen, putting it at the end of my bed, then going to sleep. I woke up at like 5 a.m. when light was just barely starting to creep into the almost pitch black room through the windows. I heard Stacy down below me, walking around. I groggily said Stacy's name, and she answered with, "Mm-hmm." I asked her if I could still borrow a nice top to wear for my presentation later that day. She went, "Mm-hmm," again, and I heard her open her closet door. I said thanks. I looked down at her and saw her bent over in the closet. Then she got out and waved at me as she went to leave the dorm. The sound of the door closing snapped me out of my daze just a bit more. I remember grabbing my phone to check the time, and just to naturally check for any notifications. It was around 5 a.m. I wondered where Stacy could have been going. Most likely the bathroom, like she often would in the middle of the night. The waving was just a bit unusual though. But then I heard a snore from below me in the lower bunk. At first I thought I imagined it. Like, how could that be possible? I peered my head over the edge of the top bunk, and there was Stacy under the sheets. Did I just dream seeing Stacy in her closet? No, because I looked at the closet door and it was still open. I quickly hurried to the door to the room and went out to look into the hallway on both sides. There wasn't a soul in sight, but it had been at least 5 minutes since I heard the door shut. I shook Stacy awake and told her someone was just in our room. It took a few moments for her to fully wake up and snap to reality, which she then showed major concern for and rushed to check her closet for anything stolen. Nothing was stolen though. I still to this day don't know who that was or how she got in. I reported it to university police, but their investigation and review of the camera in the lobby of the building turned up nothing. But I know for a fact it wasn't a hallucination or dream. It was my freshman year in the University of Alabama. I had gotten my roommate's information a few weeks in advance, and his name was Brandon. This was back in 2013. We had been in contact in the weeks before classes would start. However, due to family-related reasons, Brandon had to switch to a different school right before classes even began. So for the first weekend, as everyone else was meeting their roommates, I was unpacking alone, still not yet assigned a replacement roommate. I did meet some of the other kids on my floor though. They were nice. Then, that Sunday night, my roommate arrived. He was walking through the dorm hall with a backpack looking confused, and I asked him if he had just been transferred into this building, and he said yes. I asked him if he was in dorm number 5. That wasn't the actual number of my room, I'm just using that for the story. But he said yes, that was his room. So I shook his hand, gave him my name, and told him I was his roommate. He told me his name was Robert, but to call him Bob. Unusual, I'd never met someone named Robert who preferred to be called Bob. I led Bob to the dorm, in which I had already decorated and furnished on my side. His side was still empty. He plopped his backpack on his bed and looked at me and smiled for a bit, then said in a slight Turkish accent that he didn't have all of his stuff yet. He opened his backpack and pulled out a sheet which he threw over his bed. Since it was already past 9 and tomorrow was the first day of class, Bob and I just sat on our respective beds chatting. I tried to read his vibe at first, as you do when meeting a new person, let alone your roommate. I couldn't really get a good read on him though. He seemed a little quieter. He had this very deep voice and maybe a slightly awkward vibe to him. But I was purposely not judging because people can be nervous when meeting other people for the first time. Anyway, eventually, after talking for a bit, Bob just laid flat on the bed with the sheet on it and used his backpack as a pillow. It looked incredibly uncomfortable. I had no idea how or why he was doing that. I offered him a pillow and he accepted it. I eventually fell asleep past 10. And do you ever wake up to something but you don't know what it was? That happened to me that night. I was confused why I woke up because I didn't hear anything. But that was the freaky thing. It was dead silent in there, not even the sound of Bob breathing. I flipped to my side and screamed at the tall figure looming over my bedside. I came to the realization that it was Bob after he started apologizing and said that he was just going to the bathroom. My heart was beating like it was running a marathon. I couldn't even think to ask him why he was standing over my bed like that if he was just going to the bathroom. He apologized again as he went back to his bed. I told him it's okay. Needless to say, I was wide awake after that. I slept on my side with my back to him the rest of the night though, trying to avoid the uncomfortableness. The next morning, I woke up to my alarm, and I saw Bob was still laying in his bed,
likely pretending to be sleeping still. I went through my bag to get my books and such, and I had this feeling in my gut that something was moved in my bag, like it was gone through. I looked up at Bob again, and he was still allegedly sleeping. I decided to take a couple of my more valuable things and throw them in my backpack that I took to class. In class, I emailed the housing department and then submitted a room change request online, stating my roommate made me uncomfortable. After class that day, I returned to my dorm and was confused to notice the door was being held open with a door stopper. I noticed Bob had a big duffel bag on his bed now. I guessed he was unpacking. I laid in my bed on my laptop and eventually Bob came in. He greeted me and went to his bed, where he took his duffel bag and put it under the bed, and he literally just looked at me with this empty expression. I pretended to not really notice, but his weirdness was really bothering me. I finally looked back at him with not a friendly expression, and he gave me a slight nod. Then he climbed into his bed and just laid there on his phone. Eventually, I went out to the dining hall for dinner. When I came back, Bob was still there. I didn't know what his deal was, if he'd ever leave the dorm or what. I asked him if he had class that day. He said yes, but just one. That night, after turning the lights off, I noticed Bob leaning on the wall in his bed, facing me on his phone. I constantly felt like he was looking at me. I was anxious to get a response from the housing department, so I checked my email and saw they responded, but it wasn't the response I was hoping for. The lady who emailed me back expressed confusion in my request, stating my replacement roommate had not yet been assigned and that there should be no one else in the room with me. I looked at Bob, who looked back at me. I was about to ask him if he had his key to the room on him. I didn't ask that though. I put my laptop and other belongings in my backpack and duffel bag, as he just watched. He didn't say anything, and I think he knew that I knew. I left the room without saying anything, went to a safe place and called campus police to report him. By the time they arrived to the dorms, Bob, or whatever his real name was gone, along with his little bit of stuff. I found out that night that he stole some clothes from me, my iPhone charger, and some of the food I stored in my closet. As for what he was doing watching me sleep, I could only imagine he was making sure I was asleep before going through my stuff. I had a completely random, possibly homeless person in my room for basically an entire 24 hours. My real roommate moved in 2 days later.